The city never truly slept. It only changed its breathing. At 3 in the morning, Chicago exhaled differently. Slower, lower. A long, ragged pull of neon and exhaust, and something darker underneath, something that had no name in the language of ordinary people. Dante Moretti stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse on the 53rd floor of the Varro Tower and watched the city breathe, and he felt, as he always felt at this hour, like the only man alive who understood what it was really saying. Below him, the grid of streetlights carved the near north side into perfect amber rectangles. He could see the lake from here on clear nights, a vast black nothing beyond the glittering edge of the city, as if the world simply ended somewhere east of Lakeshore Drive, and there was nothing beyond it but void. He found that comforting sometimes, the idea of an edge, the idea that something could simply stop. He had a glass of Barolo in his hand. He hadn't drunk from it in 20 minutes. "You're doing that thing again," said a voice behind him. Dante didn't turn. He knew the voice the way he knew the sound of his own heartbeat. Constant, slightly irritating, impossible to ignore. What thing? Standing at the window at 3 in the morning, looking like a man who's about to do something poetic and terrible. Marco Aguilar crossed the living room with the unhurried ease of a man who had been Dante's second for 11 years and feared very little in the world, except Dante himself. He was shorter than Dante by 4 inches, broader across the chest, with a jaw like a shovel and eyes that missed nothing. He dropped into one of the low leather chairs that faced the window and propped his feet on the glass coffee table. "We got confirmation from the Brennan crew. The shipment arrives Thursday." "I know." "Falcone wants a sit-down. He's been patient, but Falcone is never patient. He's calculating. There's a difference." Dante finally turned from the window. In the low amber light of the penthouse, he was a study in controlled darkness. The charcoal suit, the open collar, the jaw that carried 3 days of shadow. He was 41 years old, and he had the face of a man who had seen everything worth seeing and found none of it particularly surprising. His eyes were the colour of deep water in winter, grey-green and cold, and the only people who looked directly into them for any length of time were the people who wanted something from him, or the people who were about to be very sorry. "Tell Falcone I'll see him Friday. Neutral ground. The restaurant on Wabash." "He won't like neutral ground." "He's not supposed to." Dante set the untouched wine down on the bar. "What else?" Marco hesitated. That hesitation was notable. Marco hesitated about as often as he wore pastel colours, which was never. "There's something else. Minor. Doesn't need your attention tonight." "Tell me." "The community centre on Archer. The one in Bridgeport." Dante went still, in a way that had nothing to do with stillness. It was the quality of attention that certain predators have, the frozen, hyper-focused readiness of something that had heard a sound it didn't expect. "What about it?" "New director. Woman named Elena Vasquez. She's been there about 2 months. She's—" Marco paused, choosing words with the care of a man diffusing something. "She's been talking to people in the neighbourhood, asking questions about protection money. Specifically, she's been telling the shopkeepers on Halstead that they don't have to pay it." A long silence. "Has she?" Dante said. "She's not threatening us. She's not going to the police. She's just—" Another pause. She's just telling people they have the right to say no. She's been helping a couple of the older merchants write letters. I don't think she fully understands what she's walking into." Dante picked up the wine and finally drank. A long, slow sip, his eyes fixed on some middle distance that had nothing to do with the room. The Bridgeport neighborhood had been under Moretti control for 30 years. His father had built the network there, the protection arrangements, the quiet agreements, the invisible infrastructure of favors and fear that kept everything running smoothly. It wasn't a particularly brutal system as these things went. Nobody got hurt who didn't make choices that invited hurt. The shopkeepers paid a modest amount each month, and in return they had genuine protection, from the gangs that would otherwise carve up the neighborhood, from the city inspectors who could be convinced to find problems where none existed, from the random entropy of urban violence. It was, in its way, a service. He was aware that this was the kind of logic that men like him used to sleep at night. "Find out everything about her," Dante said, quietly. "Already started." Marco stood, straightening his jacket. "She's not from Chicago. Grew up in San Antonio. Degree in social work from UT Austin. Masters from Northwestern. 32 years old. No criminal record, obviously. No significant relationships on file. She moved here 8 months ago." He paused. "She's been sleeping at the community center some nights. The building's heating system is broken, and she's been paying for repairs out of her own pocket." Dante looked at him. "Like I said," Marco said carefully, "doesn't seem to fully understand what she's walking into." After Marco left, Dante stood at the window for another hour. The city breathed its 3 in the morning breath below him, amber and cold and vast. He thought about a woman sleeping in a broken building in Bridgeport because she believed enough in something to pay for it herself. He thought about 30 years of the kind of life that had landed him here, in this glass tower above everything, with a glass of wine he couldn't make himself enjoy, and a meeting with a man named Falcone on Friday that would require him to be something he had spent the last 2 years becoming less certain he wanted to be. He thought about edges, the idea that something could simply stop. He didn't sleep that night. Elena Vasquez had a system. The cot was in the back office, behind the filing cabinets that she'd inherited from the previous director, a tired man named Gerald Hooper, who had apparently spent his last 3 years of tenure filing nothing and collecting motivational posters that he'd left behind when he resigned, their laminated surfaces furred with dust. She'd taken down most of the posters. One she'd left, a faded photograph of a sunrise over water with the words, "The only way out is through," printed beneath it, in a font that was trying very hard to be inspirational and mostly succeeding. And she'd left it, not because she found it particularly beautiful, but because it had been there when she arrived, and it felt like bad luck to remove the only thing in the room that was trying. The system was wool socks, 2 blankets, her Northwestern sweatshirt over her pajamas, and her phone on the cot beside her, playing the kind of low-volume jazz that her mother used to put on Sunday mornings in San Antonio when the kitchen smelled of coffee and pan dulce, and the world was still the size of one family's happiness. The heating was supposed to be fixed by Wednesday. The contractor had told her Wednesday 4 times now, each time with the cheerful confidence of a man for whom Wednesday was a theoretical construct rather than a specific day on the calendar. She didn't particularly mind the cold. What she minded was that the children's room, the big, bright space on the north side of the building with the murals she'd started commissioning, the ones that showed the neighbourhood as it could be rather than as it was too cold to use until Wednesday, theoretical. And the after-school programme had been running in the main hall instead, which was fine but cramped, and Mrs. Reyes had complained twice about the echo, and 8-year-old Marcus had knocked over the papier-mâché volcano that the Thursday Science Club had been building for 3 weeks, and the subsequent tears had lasted 45 minutes. Elena turned onto her back and stared at the ceiling. This was the job. She'd known what the job was when she took it. The Bridgeport Community Centre had been operating at 30% capacity for 2 years. The funding had been cut, the previous director had checked out long before he resigned, and the neighbourhood had slowly stopped believing the building on Archer Street had anything to offer them. She'd taken the position because nobody else had applied, because she had a master's degree in community development and enough stubbornness to outfit a small army, and because she had a specific, somewhat irrational belief that places could be healed the same way people could, not by fixing everything at once, but by consistently showing up. She was good at showing up. What she hadn't fully anticipated, or perhaps had chosen not to anticipate because anticipating it might have made her turn away from the job before she got here, was the money situation. Not just the centre's budget, which was genuinely dire, but the neighbourhood economy. The small businesses on Halstead and on Archer, the dry cleaner and the corner grocery, and the woman who ran the alteration shop with the incredible window display, the tamale stand that had been there since 1987. They were paying money to people they shouldn't have to pay money to. Elena had figured this out in her first month, the way you figured out most things about a neighbourhood, not through any dramatic revelation, but through the slow accumulation of small things. The way Mr. Chen at the grocery kept a second ledger. The way nobody on the street seemed surprised when she mentioned it, only careful. The way Dolores, who ran the alterations shop, had looked at her for a long, measuring moment when Elena asked directly, and then said quietly, "You're new here, honey," in a tone that was simultaneously a warning and a verdict. She hadn't been deterred. Being deterred was not something Elena Vasquez was built for. She'd spent 3 weeks listening before she did anything. She'd drunk approximately 40 cups of coffee in small businesses across Bridgeport, and she'd listened to people tell her about the neighbourhood with the particular mix of pride and exhaustion that characterized people who loved difficult places. She'd heard names spoken carefully and names not spoken at all. She'd heard the shape of the thing without anyone having to describe it directly, the way you could understand the size of something by the way people moved around it. And then she'd started talking. Not to the police. She wasn't naive enough to think the police were the answer here, or at least not the first answer. Not before she understood what she was actually dealing with. She'd started by simply telling people, one at a time, in private, that they had options, that there were legal channels, that the community centre could help them document things, connect them with advocacy organisations, explore what protections actually existed. She was careful and she was quiet, and she was, she thought, fairly responsible about it. She had not, in any meaningful sense, considered what happened when the information got to whoever was at the top of the arrangement. She thought about this now, staring at the ceiling. She thought about it with the clear-eyed practicality of a woman who had grown up in a neighbourhood not entirely unlike this one, where the structures of informal power were woven through daily life like weather, and where you learned to respect weather not because you feared it, but because ignoring it was stupid. She wasn't afraid, exactly. She was, perhaps, ready to be more careful. Her phone buzzed. A text from her friend Pilar, sent at 11:30 p.m. San Antonio time, which meant Pilar had been drinking wine and thinking about her. "Are you eating actual food, or is it protein bars again? Answer honestly." Elena smiled in the dark. "Real food," she typed back. "Mrs. Reyes made me tamales today." "Okay, that's acceptable. How's the job?" "Good," she typed. Then, after a moment, "Complicated." "Complicated how?" She stared at the ceiling again. The jazz played softly. Outside the building, Archer Street was quiet in the way that streets in mid-November were quiet. A cold, settled quiet, full of potential. "I'll tell you about it when I'm less tired," she sent. "Go to sleep." She put the phone down and pulled the blanket higher, and thought about the tamales Mrs. Reyes had pressed on her, in aluminium foil, with the casual, absolute authority of a woman who had decided that Elena needed feeding and was not going to accept any argument on the subject. She thought about the kids in the after-school program and Marcus's volcano and the mural on the north wall that she'd commissioned from a local artist, a young man named Deshawn, who was 23 and extraordinarily talented, and who had painted the neighborhood's history in panels that moved from past to present to something that wasn't the present yet, a future version of Bridgeport that was vibrant and safe and full of people who looked like the people who actually lived there. She thought, "This is why I'm here. This specific thing, this is it." And then she went to sleep, and outside, Archer Street held its cold November quiet. And somewhere across the city, a man stood at a window above everything and thought about edges, and neither of them knew yet that the distance between where they were would become the most important geography of both their lives. The restaurant on Wabash was called Serafina's, and it was the kind of place that existed in the specific intersection of genuine quality and strategic ambiguity. The food was exceptional, the wine list was serious, and the private dining room in the back could be reached through a side door that did not appear on the restaurant's website. It had been a neutral meeting ground for the better part of 2 decades, because both the Moretti organization and the Falcone interests had independently decided that destroying a restaurant that served food this good would be a waste, and both parties were capable of at least that much aesthetic judgment. Dante arrived first. He always arrived first. This was deliberate, a habit he'd maintained since his father taught him at 16 that the man who arrives first owns the room before anyone else enters it. He sat with his back to the wall, which was also deliberate, and he ordered water and looked at the menu without reading it, and waited. Vincent Falcone arrived 8 minutes late. He was 63, silver-haired, with the broad, carefully maintained physicality of a man who had once been genuinely dangerous, and now kept fit more out of pride than necessity. He wore a suit that had been made for him specifically, which Dante knew because he'd had the same tailor until 2 years ago. And he moved through the room with the particular ease of someone accustomed to people watching him move. He brought 2 men with him. Dante had brought Marco and a younger man named Santos, who stood near the door with the particular stillness that good security people learned to inhabit. The presence of the additional bodies was a statement rather than a necessity. Both men understood this. Dante. Falcone sat across from him and did not offer his hand. This, too, was a statement. You look tired. I'm always tired, Vincent. How are your grandchildren? A flash of something genuine crossed Falcone's face, a weakness he'd never managed to fully conceal, which was why Dante mentioned it, not as a threat, but as a reminder that they were both still human beings at a table. Growing too fast. My youngest started walking last month. A pause. You should have children, Dante. It changes what you're willing to fight for. I know what I'm willing to fight for. The server came. They ordered. Falcone got the branzino, Dante got nothing, and the server retreated with the trained discretion of someone who had worked this room long enough to understand that invisibility was a professional virtue. The Brennan situation, Falcone said, is handled. Handled how? In a way that doesn't require your involvement. Dante's voice was level, the way still water is level, surface calm over significant depth. The Brennans understood the terms. There won't be another problem from that direction. Falcone studied him with the patient, measuring look of a chess player 3 moves ahead of the current position. You've been operating differently these past months, he said. My people tell me you've been... A slight pause, choosing the word with precision. Cautious. Some of the older arrangements you've been letting go quiet. The Bridgeport Protection Network. He paused here specifically. I hear you've been loosening some of that. Dante kept his face entirely still. This was information Falcone should not have, which meant someone in Dante's organization was talking to someone in Falcone's organization, which was a problem to be addressed separately and carefully. Bridgeport is mine to manage. Of course, I'm only noting Vincent. Dante leaned forward slightly, just slightly, a centimetre of movement that somehow changed the entire temperature of the table. If you have something to say to me, say it directly. We're not young men anymore. Let's not perform. A long pause. Outside the private room, the restaurant continued its elegant, oblivious life. The murmur of other conversations, the soft clink of glassware, a woman's laugh ascending briefly above the ambient noise and then subsiding. Falcone leaned back in his chair and seemed to make a decision. There are people who wonder if you're still committed, he said, to the work, to the organization, to the arrangements that have kept this city stable for 30 years. He held up a hand. I'm not one of them. I want to be clear about that. I have no doubts about you personally, Dante, but there are voices, and voices become conversations, and conversations become plans, and I would rather you and I understood each other clearly before someone else's plan became relevant. This was the threat. It was elegantly delivered and perfectly calibrated, and it was nonetheless a threat. Dante sat with it for a moment. He thought about his father, who had built this world. He thought about the 15-year-old boy who had watched his father conduct business and thought, this is power. This is what it looks like. He thought about the 41-year-old man he'd become, standing at a window at 3 in the morning with a glass of wine he couldn't drink, looking at an edge. Tell the voices, he said finally, that I appreciate their concern. and tell them that the next time one of them sends a representative to observe my operations in Bridgeport, I'll want to have a much less pleasant conversation than this one." Falcone's eyes sharpened. "That's not direct, Vincent. We agreed." Dante stood, setting his napkin on the table with the precise care of a man who controlled every gesture he made. "The Brennan situation is resolved. Bridgeport is stable. The Thursday shipment will proceed on schedule." He looked down at Falcone with an expression that was not unkind and not warm, and contained multitudes. "Enjoy your branzino. It really is exceptional here." He walked out through the side door without looking back. In the car, Marco was quiet for 3 blocks, which was how long it took him to decide to speak. "That was more confrontational than I expected." "He needed to know I'm not afraid of him." "Are you?" Dante looked out the window at the city sliding past, the Friday night crowds on the sidewalks, the restaurants and bars with their yellow windows like small, warm promises. "No," he said. "I'm afraid of something else entirely." Marco waited. "I'm afraid," Dante said slowly, as if he were discovering the words as he spoke them, "of staying." The car moved through the city. Neither of them said anything else. He drove to Bridgeport on a Tuesday. This was not how Dante Moretti typically operated. His relationship with the neighborhoods that fell under the organization's protection was mediated by Marco, by the neighborhood lieutenants, by the tiered structure of intermediaries that insulated him from the operational details and, not coincidentally, insulated the operational details from him. He was not in the habit of visiting locations personally unless the situation required a specific calibration of presence. He was not, in any conventional sense, the kind of man who went for drives. He told himself he was checking on the situation. He told himself this with the practiced fluency of a man who had been lying to himself for long enough that the lies had developed a certain polish. He drove himself, which was also unusual. The black Audi moved through the streets of Bridgeport in the grey November afternoon with the low-key anonymity of a car that was expensive, but not ostentatiously so. Chosen for exactly that reason years ago. He knew the neighborhood the way he knew all the neighborhoods, which was to say precisely and at a remove. The way you know a map rather than a place. The streets, he knew them. The particular quality of light on Archer at 4 in the afternoon in November. The way the old bungalows held themselves against the cold with a certain stubborn dignity. This he had not known before, because he had never been here at 4 in the afternoon in November. He found the community center without difficulty. It was a 2-story brick building that had clearly been through several iterations of purpose. The bones were Depression-era institutional, solid and square, with tall windows that let in maximum light in the way that Depression-era architects had understood was a form of hope. Someone had painted the front door a specific, deliberate shade of yellow. Not cautious yellow, not compromise yellow, but the yellow of someone who had decided that this building was going to announce itself whether the neighborhood was ready or not. There were children's drawings in the front windows. Hand-painted letters above the entrance read, "Bridgeport Community Center. Everyone welcome." He sat in the car for several minutes. Through the yellow door and the tall windows, he could see movement, the blur of small figures that resolved, as he watched, into children. After-school program. Tuesday. He had read this in the file Marco had assembled, and he had read it with the detached, systematic attention he gave to all operational information. And now He sat in a parked car on Archer Street, watching children move behind glass, and felt something that he identified, after a moment of uncharacteristic uncertainty, as something in the vicinity of grief. Not for anything specific. Grief didn't work that way in his experience. It was more like the grief was for a general category of things. Rooms he had never been in, lives he had not lived, the particular version of himself that had not become this. He got out of the car. He was not entirely sure why. He told himself he was conducting a reconnaissance, that he needed to understand the situation with the community director firsthand rather than through Marco's careful summaries. He told himself this as he crossed the sidewalk and opened the yellow door and stepped into the warmth of the building, and by the time the door closed behind him, he had stopped telling himself things entirely. Because standing at a folding table near the entrance, surrounded by the organized chaos of a Tuesday after-school program, was a woman who was simultaneously telling a small boy that volcanoes required patience and not rushing the baking soda, and helping an older girl with what appeared to be a long division problem, and laughing at something a third child had said. A full, unguarded laugh that had nothing performed about it, nothing calculating, nothing that was designed to be witnessed. He stopped in the doorway. She hadn't seen him yet. She was bent over the table, dark hair pulled back in a knot that had mostly surrendered to the afternoon, wearing dark jeans and a green flannel shirt over a northwestern t-shirt. And she was... The word arrived in his mind with a specificity that surprised him. Luminous was not the right word, not exactly, because luminous implied something passive, something that radiated without effort. She was active. She was directing her attention outward with the focused generosity of someone who had an enormous amount of it and no interest in hoarding it. And the children around her were arranged in the unconscious orbit of people who know they are safe and valued. "Can I help you?" She was looking at him now. She had straightened up from the table and was looking at him with the direct, assessing gaze of someone who spent a lot of time figuring out what people needed. Her eyes were dark brown and currently cautious. A stranger in the doorway warranted caution, she had apparently decided, while not yet warranting alarm. "I was in the neighborhood," Dante said. It was the least Dante Moretti thing he had ever said in his adult life. "Okay," she said. "Are you here for anything specific? We have the after-school program running, and there's a GED class starting at 5:30, and if you're looking for—" "What's the yellow door about?" he said. She blinked. "I'm sorry?" "The paint. The yellow door. It's very specific." She looked at him for a moment with the particular expression of someone recalibrating their read of a situation. Then something in her face shifted. The caution didn't go away entirely, but it made room for something else, something that might have been genuine curiosity. "It was the colour I could afford," she said. "The hardware store on Halstead was selling off discontinued colours, but I picked it because—" A slight pause, and the ghost of the laugh that he'd seen through the window. "Because it was impossible to ignore. I want this building to be impossible to ignore." "Is it working?" he asked. "Getting there," she said. And then, because she was apparently a woman who asked the questions she wanted to ask, "I haven't seen you in the neighbourhood before, and I've met most people on this block." "First time," he said. "Are you new to Bridgeport?" "No," he said. And then, because something in the honesty of the room, The children's drawings in the window, the volcano in progress, the long division problem seemed to demand a reciprocal honesty. "No, I've just never come here before." She held his gaze for a beat longer than was conventional. He was used to people looking away from him quickly, his eyes, his size, the particular quality of stillness he'd cultivated for 20 years, all worked together to create an impression that was not conducive to extended eye contact. She didn't look away. "I'm Elena Vasquez," she said. "I run the center." "I know," he said, and then, "I'm Dante." He didn't give the last name. She didn't ask for it. But something moved through her expression, swift, subtle, a ripple on still water, and he understood that she had heard the name before, that it had been spoken in this neighborhood with the careful intonation people used for things they both feared and respected, and that she was choosing, in real time, how to hold what she'd just learned. "Well, Dante," she said, with a composure that he found, against every expectation, genuinely impressive. "You're welcome here. Everyone is." He should have left. He knew he should have left. The reconnaissance was complete. He had what he came for, which was a visual confirmation that the situation was precisely what Marco had described, and no more dangerous than a woman with a yellow door and genuine conviction. And the appropriate next step was to return to the car and reassess the Bridgeport protection arrangements with the calm, strategic intelligence that had kept him operational for 20 years. He stayed for 45 minutes. In his defense, and he would spend considerable time afterward constructing a defense, which was itself a notable change from his usual practice of doing things without requiring justification. There was a boy named Marcus who had apparently been having a very bad week and who had attached himself to the table where Dante sat with the instinctive accuracy of children for adults who have stopped pretending. Marcus was 9 years old, wore a jacket that was slightly too big for him, and was building something with wooden blocks that had a structural ambition far exceeding its engineering logic. "That's going to fall," Dante said. Marcus looked at him. "It's not going to fall. The center of gravity is too high. The base needs to be wider if you want it to stay up." A pause. Marcus studied his construction with the critical eye of someone who suspected he was being told the truth, but wasn't entirely ready to concede it. "How do you know about center of gravity?" "I know about structures," Dante said, which was true in several senses. Marcus moved 2 blocks from the upper level to the base, studied it again, moved 1 more. "Like that? Better. Try the red one here." They rebuilt the structure in companionable silence for several minutes, and this was how Elena found them when she came back from helping the older students. Dante Moretti, whose name was spoken in hushed registers across 4 Chicago neighborhoods. Sitting at a child-sized table, moving wooden blocks with a 9-year-old, with the complete, unself-conscious focus of a man who had, for this specific interval, nothing more important to do. She stood in the doorway of the children's room for a moment before either of them noticed her. Something moved across her face, a complicated emotion quickly contained. "Marcus," she said, coming to them, "it's 5 o'clock. Your grandmother's going to be here in 10 minutes. "We're fixing my tower," Marcus said. "I can see that." She looked at the tower, which was now considerably more stable than it had been. Then she looked at Dante with an expression that was carefully neutral and somehow, underneath the neutrality, not neutral at all. "You have some experience with construction." "Some," he said. "That's surprising." She said it without inflection, which was its own kind of inflection. is it? Most people who walk in off the street aren't usually thinking about load-bearing principles. He met her eyes. I'm not most people. No, she said, and she said it in a way that he couldn't quite pass. Acknowledgement, certainly, but of what exactly he couldn't determine. I don't think you are. Marcus's grandmother arrived, a small, formidable woman in a winter coat who collected her grandson with the efficiency of a military operation and left with the kind of nod to Dante that people in the neighborhood had learned to give to people in Dante's position, a gesture that contained equal measures of wariness and pragmatic acknowledgement. Dante watched them go and felt the specific, familiar discomfort of being recognized for what he was, rather than who he was. The after-school program wound down around him. Parents arrived, children departed. The particular energy of the room, kinetic, loud, densely inhabited, drained away until there were only the two of them, and a young volunteer named Amara, who was stacking chairs with the focused determination of a person trying to finish a task before anyone could add to it. You don't have to stay, Eleanor said. She was collecting papers from the table, drawings, homework assignments, the detritus of a productive afternoon. Her voice was steady and offered him the door without pushing him toward it. I know, he said. She looked at him then, a full look, without the careful management she'd been applying since the moment she identified his name. She was trying, he understood, to reconcile things. The man who had just spent 30 minutes helping a child build a stable tower against the name that was spoken quietly in her neighborhood as shorthand for a particular kind of power. She was looking for the seam where those two things connected, and finding it harder to locate than she'd expected. Why did you actually come here today? She asked. He considered several answers. He discarded all of them, except the one that was true. I heard about the work you're doing, he said. I wanted to see it. You heard I was telling your people not to take money from the shopkeepers on Halstead? It wasn't a question. She said it with the directness of someone who had decided that pretending not to know things was a waste of both their time. Yes, he said, that too. And? He looked at her steadily. And the center of gravity is too high, he said, on what you're doing. You need a wider base before you push too hard in that direction. She was quiet for a moment. He could see her working through the layers of what he'd just said, the warning, the metaphor, the fact that he'd delivered both in the vocabulary of the thing they'd just been doing together. Is that a threat? She asked. Steady, no tremor. No, he said. It's the same advice I gave Marcus. Another silence. The volunteer Amara had finished stacking the chairs and departed with a quiet good night, leaving them alone in the room with the children's drawings and the half-finished volcano and the low winter light coming through the tall windows. You could just stop the collections yourself, Elena said, if you wanted to. The simplicity of it, the absolute undecorated directness, landed somewhere in his chest like a key turning in a lock. She wasn't threatening him, wasn't maneuvering, wasn't calculating. She was just saying the plain thing that was true and apparently believed he was capable of hearing it. It's not that simple, he said. Most things people say aren't that simple, she said. Ah. He stood up from the child-sized chair, which required a certain dignity of bearing to manage, and he straightened his jacket, and he looked at her one more time in the failing Tuesday light, and he thought, you have absolutely no idea what you're doing to me. And neither do I. The heating system, he said. What company is your contractor using? She blinked at the turn. Kowalski HVAC. Why? Call Martinez Heating on Western Avenue instead. Tell them Dante sent you. They'll have it fixed by tomorrow. He left before she could respond, and he walked out through the yellow door into the cold November street and stood beside his car for a long moment, feeling the specific, vertiginous sensation of a man who has just stepped onto a surface he cannot identify and has not yet determined whether it will hold his weight. The heat came back on Wednesday morning. Elena stood in the children's room and felt the warmth begin to move through the radiators, with the particular satisfaction of someone who had been fighting for something small and specific, and had, against expectation, won it quickly. The Martinez heating technician, a compact, cheerful man named Jorge, who had arrived at 7:30 with 2 assistants and moved through the building with the calm efficiency of people who knew exactly what they were doing, had declared the system repaired by 9 and had refused, with amiable firmness, to provide her with an invoice. "It's been taken care of," he said. "By whom?" she asked. He had looked at her with an expression that suggested she already knew the answer and was asking as a form of ritual protest rather than genuine inquiry. "You have a good day now," he said, and left. She stood in the warm children's room for a long time, looking at Deshawn's mural on the north wall, the panels of neighbourhood history, the possible futures, the faces painted with such loving precision that you could almost hear them talking. She was trying to work out how she felt about this, and the answer was more complicated than she wanted it to be. On one level, the heat was on, the children could use the room, the GED students wouldn't be distracted by cold, and the building was functioning the way a building was supposed to function. These were concrete goods. She was a pragmatist at heart, in the way that people who had grown up watching their parents work very hard for small improvements tended to be pragmatists. She believed in the actual, the tangible, the thing that changed a specific person's specific day. On another level, she had not asked for this, had not asked him for this, and accepting it, even passively, was a different kind of thing than the yellow door and the Wednesday contractor and the methodical, patient work of rebuilding something on her own terms. She called Pilar at noon. "Okay," Pilar said, after Elena had explained the situation with the economy of someone who had been trained by an efficiency-minded mother to say things in the fewest possible words. "This man, the person whose name you're not saying out loud on the phone, he fixed your heat. His people did, yes, without being asked. Without being asked. As a what? A warning? A gift? What is this, Elena?" "I genuinely don't know," Elena said. "That's the problem." A pause, in which Elena could hear Pilar thinking, with the particular intensity of someone who consumed an enormous amount of romantic suspense fiction and was now applying its interpretive frameworks to real life. "What does he look like?" Pilar said. "That is completely irrelevant, Elena." She looked out the window at Archer Street, quiet in the midday grey. She thought about a man at a child-sized table, moving wooden blocks with the focused calm of someone who knew about load-bearing principles. The winter-water eyes. The quality of stillness that was not emptiness. She'd known men whose stillness was emptiness, and this was not the same thing. His was the stillness of someone who was containing something very large with a great deal of effort. "He looks like someone who makes bad decisions look inevitable," she said finally. "Oh no," said Pilar. "It's fine," Elena said. "Elena, I'm a professional. He is a person in the community. He came to the center and helped a child, and apparently has a working relationship with a competent HVAC company. None of this is complicated." "You know what I notice," Pilar said. "When things are actually not complicated, you don't explain at length why they're not complicated." Elena did not dignify this with a response, which was itself a response, and Pilar knew it. Across the city, Dante was in his office on the 38th floor of the Varro Tower, which was a different floor from the penthouse and looked more like a legitimate concern, because it was a legitimate concern, several of them, in fact, because nobody stayed in this business for 20 years without building the kinds of structures that turn certain operations legitimate. He was reading a contract for a real estate development in the South Loop, and he was doing it with the portion of his attention that he could spare, because the remaining portion had been occupied since Tuesday afternoon with something he couldn't name precisely and therefore couldn't address efficiently. Marco came in at 2 o'clock and closed the door. "Falcone's people have been asking about the Bridgeport situation," he said. "More specifically, they've been asking about the community center." Dante looked up from the contract. "Someone's been talking," Marco said. "I don't know who yet, but they know you went there personally. They're interpreting that." He paused. "The woman. Elena Vasquez. They're looking at her." The temperature in the room changed. It was not a metaphorical change. Something shifted in Dante's presence that Marco had seen twice before in 11 years, both times immediately preceding events that he did not like to think about. How are they looking at her? Trying to understand her relevance. Marco chose his words with the care of a man who knew that imprecision in this specific conversation could be dangerous. "They don't think she's an asset or a threat. They're trying to determine what she is to you." "She is a community center director," Dante said, "who is doing her job." "I know that. Make sure they know that." "Dante." Marco held his gaze. "If she's nothing, you need to make that credible. And the way to make that credible is to not go back to Archer Street." A silence that lasted long enough to be communicative. "The protection arrangements in Bridgeport," Dante said. "The Halstead corridor. I want you to begin transitioning them, quietly. Start with the smaller merchants, Chen's grocery, the alterations shop, the tamale stand. Reduce the assessments. Phase them out over 6 months. Marco stared at him. Dante, that's significant revenue. And it's the kind of move that Falcone will notice." "Falcone will notice everything. That's his gift." Dante set down the contract. "Let him notice, and find out who's been talking to his people. I want to know by Monday." "And the community center?" Dante looked out his office window, which faced north, away from Bridgeport, toward the lake and the grey November sky above it. "I'll handle the community center," he said. He came back on a Saturday. He told himself, again with decreasing conviction, that it was operational. There were things in Bridgeport that required personal attention. The Kowalski contractor situation had resolved, which was good, but there were other arrangements in the neighborhood that were in transition and that benefited from a quiet, authoritative presence to smooth the process. These things were true, They were also not the reason he drove to Archer Street at 10 in the morning on a Saturday in late November with a paper bag from a bakery on Michigan Avenue containing 2 coffees and a selection of pastries that a man who was conducting an operational visit would not have purchased. The yellow door was propped open with a brick. Inside, he could hear activity, not the controlled chaos of the after-school program, but something different, more deliberate, the sound of people working toward a specific end. He pushed the door wider and stepped in. The main hall was being painted. Half a dozen people in paint-speckled clothes were working on the walls with rollers and brushes, and someone had brought a speaker that was playing something with brass in it, New Orleans or somewhere in the vicinity, and Elena was at the far end of the room on a ladder, painting the crown moulding near the ceiling, and she was singing along to the music under her breath in the unreserved way that people sang when they believed they weren't being watched. He stood in the doorway for a moment. She came down from the ladder and turned and saw him, and the singing stopped, and this was what he registered, catalogued, kept. Not because she was embarrassed. She stopped in the easy, unbothered way of someone who simply redirected their attention. There was no performance of surprise. There was a small, cautious thing behind her eyes, but her voice, when she spoke, was level. "You came back." "I said I would," he said. "You didn't say that." He held out the bakery bag. "I brought coffee." She looked at the bag. She looked at him. Something moved through her expression, a brief, complicated negotiation happening at speeds that he couldn't quite track. And then she came across the room and took the bag from him and looked inside, and her face did something involuntary and warming at the sight of the pastries. "Canelles," she said. "From where?" "Maison Hélène, on Michigan. They're an hour's drive from here." She looked up at him with the considering gaze he was beginning to recognize as her default setting for things that didn't fit her existing categories. "You drove an hour for Canelles." "The drive takes 40 minutes at this hour," he said, "and I thought you might not have eaten." A pause. "You thought correctly," she admitted. "We've been here since 8. Deshawn brought granola bars and called it breakfast, which is a position I have objections to." She introduced him to the painting crew, neighbours and volunteers, a mix of ages and levels of painting skill, gathered on a Saturday morning for the particular kind of community project that happens when someone with enough conviction and warmth asks for help, and people find, perhaps to their own surprise, that they want to give it. Dante recognized 1 or 2 faces from the neighborhood, people who would have recognized him in return, whose recognition he could see moving through their expressions as small, suppressed adjustments, a recalibration of the room's social geometry. But Elena moved through the space with such complete, unremarkable ease that recalibration seemed beside the point. She handed out coffees, distributed canapés with the democratic efficiency of someone who had thought about the fairest division of pastries, and returned to her ladder with a brush and the casual expectation that Dante would either leave or find something useful to do, and she was apparently not going to organize his decision for him. He found a roller and a paint tray. He spent 3 hours painting the east wall of the Bridgeport Community Center. It was not an activity he had performed before in any of his 41 years. The wall required 2 coats. The color was a warm cream that was considerably more carefully chosen than cream had any right to be, close to the shade of old plaster, but cleaner, more intentional, and the work required a physical attention that he found unexpectedly, something close to meditative. No decisions that mattered, no strategic considerations. The wall was the wall, and the roller was the roller, and the paint went where you put it. And if you were careful and patient, the finish was even and the result was unambiguous. At some point, Elena appeared beside him with a brush to do the edges. "You're good at that," she said. "Slow and methodical," he said, "usually gets the job done." She glanced at him sidelong. "Is that how you operate generally?" "When possible." He kept his eyes on the wall. "What are you doing here, Elena? In Chicago? In Bridgeport? You could work anywhere." She was quiet for a moment, and he was aware that the question had the quality of something more personal than he'd intended, or perhaps exactly as personal as he'd intended, and he was no longer certain he could distinguish between the two. "My mother grew up in a neighborhood like this," she said finally, "in San Antonio. Community center was the center of everything, literally the place where her family's life happened. English classes, job training, the after-school program where my uncle learned to read because he'd been falling through the cracks in school." She moved the brush along the edge of the crown molding with the attention of someone who believed that edges mattered. She always said that places like that were where the neighborhood held itself together. Not the government, not any institution, the neighbors in a room, choosing to be a community. A beat. "I believe that." "You believe a lot of things," he said. "I do." There was no apology in it. "Is that surprising?" "No," he said. "It's—" He stopped. She waited. "Rare," he said finally, "in my experience." She turned from the wall to look at him directly, and he met her eyes, and for a moment they were two people in a paint-speckled room standing 6 inches apart, with the particular proximity that labour produces, and the air between them was warm from the bodies in the room, and the quality of the look she was giving him had nothing careful about it, nothing managed. "What do you believe?" she asked. Quiet, genuine. He thought about his father's world, and everything he'd built inside it. He thought about the window at 3 in the morning. He thought about a edge and the void beyond it. "I'm working on that," he said. She held his gaze for one more beat. Then she nodded, a slow, serious nod, as if this were an acceptable and even interesting answer, and turned back to the wall and continued painting. They worked side by side until the east wall was finished. Marco Aguilar had been with Dante Moretti for 11 years, during which time he had watched his employer negotiate with federal informants, face down a rival organization's explicit threat of violence with the serene equanimity of a man reviewing a menu, and once sit completely still and silent for 4 hours while an extremely uncomfortable situation resolved itself through patience alone. He had never, in 11 years, seen Dante Moretti paint a wall. He knew about the Saturday visit. He knew because it was his job to know. His job being, in its broadest formulation, to keep Dante alive and operational. And that job required information, and information in their business was gathered continuously and without permission. He had a contact at the Martinez Heating Company, and a contact among the Saturday painting volunteers, and a contact in the Bridgeport neighborhood who kept him aware of anything that might constitute a variable in the organization's operations. This was not surveillance, it was maintenance. He went to Dante on Monday morning with 2 things: the information about who had been talking to Falcone's people, and the information about Saturday. He presented the first thing first. "Danny Ortega," he said. "He's been taking calls from Luca Falcone for about 3 months. Small stuff initially, neighborhood gossip. It escalated." Dante's expression didn't change. Danny Ortega has been with us for 8 years. 7, I know. Is he greedy or is he scared? Scared, I think. Luca was the one who approached him. I think Danny felt like he didn't have a choice. Marco paused. He has a daughter at St. Xavier's. Scholarship. Luca found that. Dante was quiet for a moment. Put Danny on leave. Paid. Don't make it punitive. Make it clear it's a cooling off period while we assess the situation. And make sure Luca Falcone understands that the thing with the daughter is off the table. That category of pressure is not something I permit. And Luca? Luca is Vincent's problem, not mine. I'll communicate that to Vincent. He paused. Gently. Marco made a note. Then, there's the other thing. Dante looked at him. You spent Saturday in Bridgeport, Marco said, at the community centre, painting. A silence. Yes. For 3 hours. The east wall needed 2 coats. Marco had the particular experience in this moment of a man who was trying to determine how to say something to someone he respected and cared about, and who had, on this specific subject, taken leave of the operational clarity that characterized him in every other context. He chose directness, because Dante had always responded to directness better than to anything else. This is a problem, he said. I'm aware that you think so. She's already a variable, Dante. She's been talking to the merchants. She's on Falcone's radar now because of the protection arrangement changes. If she becomes... He stopped, started again. If your relationship with her is visible in a certain way, she becomes leverage. That's the word that will be used. Leverage. Dante was very still in the particular way that Marco had learned to read carefully. Nobody touches her, he said. The words were quiet and had no inflection and carried the specific weight of things said once and not repeated. I'm not saying anyone would. Nobody touches her, Dante said again. That's not a prediction. That's a fact about what happens to anyone who tries. Marco exhaled. Then you need to be more careful. The visits need to stop, or they need to stop being visible, or I'm transitioning the Bridgeport collections, Dante said. All of them. Not just the Halstead corridor. All of it. By spring, the organization's financial relationship with Bridgeport is clean. Legitimate. The community centre gets a donation through the South Loop Development Foundation. Anonymous. Large enough to fund operations for 3 years. Marco stared at him. This was significant. This was beyond the operational adjustments he'd been anticipating. This was the kind of structural change that would be noticed at levels well above Luca Falcone's capacity to cause problems about. Dante, he said carefully, this is the kind of move that looks like what? Like a man who's planning to leave, Marco said. That's the word that will go around. And then it won't just be Luca Falcone asking questions. It'll be people who are considerably more thorough in how they find their answers. Dante stood up from his desk and walked to the window, the office window, the one that faced north, and stood there with his hands in his pockets, looking at the grey December sky. And Marco watched him and thought about 11 years, and the man he'd watched become whatever this was, this specific, dangerous, careful, controlled, and somehow, increasingly, open was the wrong word. Cracked was the word. Like stone that is beginning to give way to something growing through it. Find out what it would take, Dante said. To leave. Actually leave. Not disappear. I'm not naive, but to step back from the operations, to put the organization in a state where it runs without me at the center of it. A pause. Legitimately, as much as possible. You'd need Vincent's blessing, Marco said, or his capitulation, and you'd need to give him something big enough that stepping back isn't read as weakness, because weakness in this position is an invitation. I know. And you'd need time. A year, minimum, 18 months to do it right. Then we start now, Dante said. And Marco, he turned from the window, she doesn't know anything about this, none of it. What I am, what I'm doing, what any of it means. She knows my name, and she knows her neighborhood, and she knows I can use a paint roller. That's what she knows. His voice had a quality that Marco had not heard before in 11 years, something rawer than authority, something closer to actual need. She needs to stay clean, whatever happens. Promise me that. Marco looked at him for a long time. I promise, he said finally. Good, Dante said. He turned back to the window. Find me something to give Falcone. The South Loop Development Foundation held its annual winter gala at the Lyric Opera House in early December. Because if you were going to raise money for urban development initiatives, you might as well do it somewhere that suggested civilization was worth the effort. Dante attended every year. It was one of the events that existed at the precise overlap of his legitimate business interests and the careful social positioning that kept those interests viable. The kind of room where city commissioners and real estate developers and foundation directors circulated in expensive clothes and talked about the city's future with the optimistic energy of people who had enough cushion between themselves and the city's present to believe the future was the more relevant topic. He arrived at 8. He did what was required. The conversations, the introductions, the specific calibration of presence and attention that these events demanded. He talked to a city alderman about a zoning consideration on the South Loop development. He talked to the head of a foundation about a grant application. He talked to a developer from New York who was considering a Chicago expansion and wanted Dante's read on the North Side market. He was doing this, the New York developer whose name was Hargrove and who had the particular energy of a man who had recently read too many urban planning manifestos, when he saw her. She was across the room, near the bar, talking to a small cluster of people that included, Dante identified after a moment, the executive director of the Chicago Community Trust and 2 women he didn't recognize. Elena was wearing a dark green dress, something simple and precise, the kind of thing that had clearly not been purchased for this room, but fit it nonetheless because the person wearing it fit any room she entered, not through performance, but through the particular quality of her attention, the way she was listening to the woman speaking to her, with the same complete, focused presence she brought to 9-year-olds and their block towers. She had not seen him yet. He excused himself from Hargrove, gently, correctly, with the smooth social efficiency of someone who had been doing this for 2 decades, and moved through the room. He was aware as he moved of the social geometry shifting around him, of the way people made small adjustments in his direction, the kind of micro-corrections that happened automatically in rooms that contained a certain specific kind of power. He was used to it. He moved through it the way water moves through a channel it has carved over time. He reached the bar. He was 6 feet from her before she turned and saw him. The look on her face was not the carefully managed neutrality she'd deployed on Archer Street. It was something more immediate. Recognition. Then something else, something she was working to contain. Then the neutrality arriving a half-second late, like a curtain drawn after the room has already been seen. "Dante," she said. Elena. He looked at her and did not look away, which was a choice he was aware he was making. You look... He stopped, started again. I didn't know you'd be here. The community centre was invited, she said. Technically, I'm representing Bridgeport's community development sector. A slight pause, and the ghost of something rueful, which mostly means I'm here trying to pitch a grant application to anyone who'll listen and feeling extremely underdressed. You're not underdressed, he said. You look... Again, he stopped. The word he was reaching for was not a word he used in professional settings, or any settings, with any frequency, because it was not a word that had been particularly relevant to his life. The word was beautiful, which was inadequate, and he was not a man accustomed to vocabulary failing him. You look like you belong in this room, he said, even if you don't think so. Something shifted in her expression. Is that a compliment? Yes, he said directly. She looked at him with that assessing look that he was beginning to understand was the look she gave things she was taking seriously. Then she said, Are you going to tell me sometime what you actually do, beyond... She made a small gesture that encompassed, he understood, the room, the city, the specific weight of the name Moretti in certain conversations. Beyond what I already know. What do you already know? I know that when you call an HVAC company and say your name, they come at 7:30 the next morning and refuse to take payment. She kept her voice low, below the ambient noise of the room. I know that the protection money situation in my neighborhood has been changing quietly over the past 3 weeks, and I know the timing of that. Her eyes were on his, steady and dark and asking for something. I know that you spent a Saturday painting my east wall. A pause. I'm trying to understand what those things add up to. What do you want them to add up to? He asked, and then was surprised by what he'd said, because it was not a strategic question, and it was not a carefully considered question, and it was exactly the kind of question that a man in his position should not ask in a room like this. She was quiet for a moment. I want them to add up to a person, she said finally. Someone who's actually making choices, not just operating. She said the last word with precision, with an awareness of its weight. You can make choices, Dante. I think you know that. He looked at her and felt the specific vertigo of a man standing at an edge and seeing for the first time that what's on the other side might be worth the fall. Have dinner with me, he said. Not here. Somewhere that isn't. He gestured slightly, indicating the gala, the room, the specific performance of all of it. Somewhere real. She held his gaze for a long time. He could see the calculation happening. Not cold calculation, not cynical, but the serious consideration of a woman who understood that this was not a small decision and was giving it the weight it deserved. Okay, she said. Somewhere real. He took her to a restaurant in Pilsen called La Mesa, which had 40 seats and no valet, and a menu handwritten on a chalkboard, and food that was serious without being pretentious, the kind of place that existed because the people who ran it cared about the food more than about the spectacle of caring about the food. He had eaten there twice before, alone, at the bar, which was the way he ate at places he actually liked, without company, without the social requirements of shared meals, in the manner of a man who had learned to move through public space as if he were invisible. He was not invisible tonight. Elena had changed from the gala dress into something more comfortable for the cab ride. Dark jeans, a cream-coloured blouse, her hair loose from the formal arrangement it had been in at the Lyric. She was not dressed up, and she was not dressed down. She was dressed like herself, which was, he was learning, the only register she operated in, and he found it, the word he arrived at, was clarifying, like light through clean glass. They were given a table in the back corner, which the host, who recognized Dante and made no show of it, which Dante appreciated, arranged with quiet efficiency. "Tell me something true," Elena said, once the wine arrived. No preamble. The woman did not waste time on approach. He looked at her across the small table. The candle between them cast light upward, which was not the most flattering angle for most people, but somehow suited her. It lit the directness of her gaze, the particular quality of attention she directed at things. "I'm trying to leave," he said. She was still. "Leave what?" "The work I do. He paused. The word he needed was one he had never said out loud in any social context, because saying it was either redundant or dangerous, and he had always operated in rooms where neither was acceptable. "The organization I run." She looked at him steadily. Her hands were flat on the table, not tense, not performing calm, actually calm. "Why?" she asked. He thought about the honest answer. He had a relationship with honesty that was more complicated than his relationship with most things. He was not a liar, precisely, but he had spent 20 years in an environment where information was a resource to be managed rather than a gift to be offered, and the habit of management was deep. But she had asked him for something true, and he had decided, driving to Pilsen tonight, that she would get it. "Because I'm tired," he said, "of the weight of it, of what I have to be in that world, of looking at things and seeing only leverage, angles, risks." A pause. "I want to look at something and see what it actually is." She was quiet for a moment. "What do you see when you look at me?" she asked. Not coy, not testing, genuinely asking. "Someone who is exactly what she appears to be," he said. "I've been in rooms with people for 20 years, and that is—" He stopped. The sentence was too revealing in its entirety. "It's unusual," he finished. "My mother used to say I had no filter," Eleanor said. "She meant it as a criticism. I took it as a design feature." The ghost of a smile. "What does leaving actually look like for someone in your position?" "Long," he said. "Complicated. There are people who would prefer I stay, not because they value me particularly, because a controlled transition is less comfortable than a controlled asset." "Are you safe?" she asked, direct. He looked at her, the candlelight. The question, asked in the tone of someone who had already decided to care about the answer. "Currently," he said, "yes." "And longer term?" "I'm working on it." She picked up her wine and looked at it for a moment. "I want to say something, and I need you to hear it as what it is, which is honest, and not as a judgment." She looked at him. "What you've built, the protection arrangements, the money, the influence, I've seen what it does to the people in my neighbourhood. Not just the extraction of it, the way it teaches people that power is something done to them, that they don't have agency. She paused. I'm not naive about how neighborhoods like Bridgeport work, or what fills the vacuum when organizations like yours aren't there. But the way things are isn't the only way things can be. She held his gaze. I think you know that. I think that's actually part of why you want to leave. He was quiet for a long time. The restaurant moved around them, the gentle ambient noise of other people's evenings, the smell of good food, the ordinary life of a place that had nothing to do with any of his worlds. The donation to the Community Center Foundation, he said. Anonymous. 3 years of operating budget. That was mine. She had gone still. I hadn't confirmed that. I know. I'm confirming it. He looked at her steadily. Not to create an obligation, not as currency, because the work you're doing is worth funding, and I have money, and you have a specific, important need, and it seemed like the transaction that made sense. She sat with this for a moment. He could see the complexity of it moving through her, the gratitude, the discomfort, the pragmatist who knew what 3 years of operating funding meant for the children and the GED students and Mrs. Reyes's tamale influence and Marcus's block towers, the idealist who had strong feelings about the provenance of that funding. I'll put it toward the mural project, she said finally, and the after-school expansion. And I'll spend the next 3 years making the centre self-sustaining, so I don't need the next donation. She looked at him. Don't do it again. That's my condition. Understood, he said. And I want... She stopped, started again. If this is... I want to know that whatever this is, it isn't a transaction. Not for you either. I'm not a project. I'm not someone you're helping as part of getting out. If we're going to... She gestured between them, indicating something she wasn't labeling yet. I need it to be real. He reached across the table and placed his hand over hers. It was a deliberate gesture, slow enough that she could have moved her hand before he arrived, and she didn't move it. Her hand was warm under his, and small, and very still. It's the most real thing that's happened to me in a very long time, he said. I'm aware that's not a particularly reassuring sentence coming from someone in my position. She turned her hand over under his and held it. Tell me something else true, she said. They were there for 3 hours. By the end of it, he knew about San Antonio and her mother and the community center where her uncle had learned to read, and the professor at Northwestern who had told her she was too idealistic for policy work and whom she had proven wrong in every possible way. She knew about his father and the business he'd inherited at 26, about the specific moment at age 15 when he'd understood what the family actually was, and had made a choice he was still living inside. She knew about the Barolo he couldn't make himself drink, and the window at 3 a.m, and the edge. When they left the restaurant, it was cold, and he pulled her coat more fully around her shoulders without thinking about it, an automatic gesture, and she looked up at him with an expression that he couldn't interpret fully, but that seemed to contain something significant. He didn't kiss her. He wanted to, with a specificity that surprised him, but it seemed important tonight to let what was real remain real for a while, before anything else complicated it. He put her in a cab and stood on the curb watching it go. His phone buzzed. Marco. Falcone called. Wants to move the Friday meeting up. He has new information about Brennan. He looked at the cab's retreating lights. He typed back, Wednesday, my office. Then he stood on the curb in the Pilsen cold and breathed the night air and felt the specific weight of a man who is carrying 2 worlds and beginning to understand that he cannot carry them both forever. Vincent Falcone came to the Varro Tower on Wednesday with 3 men and a piece of information that he had been holding, Dante suspected, for longer than the past 48 hours. The office on the 38th floor had been designed by Dante's architect with a specific understanding of the purposes it served, the legitimate business purposes and the other purposes, which were never discussed with the architect, but were nonetheless accommodated in the sight lines, the seating arrangements, the particular configuration of space that gave the man behind the desk an unobstructed view of the door, both doors, and the window that faced north. Falcone sat in the chair across the desk, and his 3 men arranged themselves near the entrance, and Marco stood near the north window. And the geometry of the room said everything that needed to be said about the current state of relations. "You've been busy," Falcone said. He was in a good suit today, charcoal with a subtle stripe, and he had the particular manner of a man who has prepared for a conversation. "Always am," Dante said. "The Bridgeport collections."
Falcone folded his hands on the desk. No, not the desk, the edge of the desk, a small territorial claim that Dante logged without reaction. "You've been winding them down, transitioning them. To what?" "Legitimate revenue streams. It's the direction things need to go." Dante kept his voice neutral and his posture relaxed, the same posture he'd used in 1,000 conversations of this type. "You've been saying it yourself for 2 years, Vincent. The environment is changing. Exposure risk is up. The smart money is cleaning up operations and moving them into structures that survive scrutiny." Falcone looked at him with the measuring patience of a man who knew he was being handled and didn't object to it, as long as it was done well. "The smart money," he repeated. "Yes." A pause.
"And the community centre." Dante let a fraction of a second pass. "What about it?" "My information suggests you've developed a relationship with the director." Falcone said the word with precision, without inflection. "Elena Vasquez." Dante looked at him steadily. "My personal life is not an operational discussion." "Everything is operational," Falcone said mildly. "That's the nature of what we do. You know this." He leaned back slightly. "I'm not concerned about the woman personally. She's a social worker. She's harmless." Another pause, more deliberate. "What I'm concerned about is what she represents." "And what's that?" "Sentiment," Falcone said. The word landed with surgical precision. "I've seen it before. A man reaches a certain age, certain point in his career, starts making decisions based on something other than strategy, starts seeing possibilities outside of what he's built." His eyes on Dante were not hostile, which was what made them dangerous. They were almost sympathetic. "It makes him unpredictable, and in our business, unpredictable is the most dangerous thing a man can be." "I appreciate your concern," Dante said. "I'm going to be direct," Falcone said. "There are elements within the larger structure, not me, I want to be clear, but elements, who have begun to discuss succession, what the organization looks like without you at the center of it, who benefits, who controls what." He let that sit for a moment. "This is not a threat. It's information. I'm giving it to you as a courtesy, because I have 20 years of respect for your father and 15 years of operational history with you, and because I would prefer a stable transition to an unstable one." Dante was very still. He could feel Marco's stillness across the room, the specific quality of it. "Who's driving the conversation?" he asked. "Luca has been talking to Carmine Bruno in New York. You know Carmine." He did. Carmine Bruno was 68 years old and had the patience of a man who had watched the world arrange itself around him repeatedly and saw no reason to doubt it would do so again. He was also absolutely ruthless in the way that patient men were ruthless, never reckless, never emotional, perfectly willing to wait years for the right moment. "Tell Carmine," Dante said, "that any conversation about succession happens with me at the table. And tell Luca that I have a very long memory and considerable affection for his father, which is the only reason the Ortega situation is being resolved quietly." Falcone nodded slowly. "There's something else." He reached into his jacket and produced an envelope, which he set on the desk. "This came through channels I won't specify. It's about your community center director." Dante looked at the envelope without touching it. "I told you, it's not about your relationship," Falcone said. "It's about her connection to an investigative reporter at the Tribune, a woman named Sarah Marsh. They've been in contact 3 times in the past month." He paused. "I don't know what was discussed. I don't know if the woman, Elena, initiated it or was approached. But I thought you should know." After Falcone left, Dante sat alone in his office for 15 minutes. Marco came back in and closed the door and didn't say anything, which was the correct decision. Finally, Dante said, "The Tribune reporter." "I'll look into it," Marco said, carefully. He paused. She couldn't know what that could mean. If she's talking to a reporter about the neighborhood arrangements, about the protection money, she might understand more than you think, Marco said carefully. "She's not naive, Dante." "No," he said, "she's not." He stood up. "Find out what's been said. But Marco," he held his deputy's gaze, "nobody approaches her. Nobody contacts her. Nobody makes her feel the weight of this. That's absolutely clear." "Absolutely," Marco said. Dante walked to the north window and stood there and thought about a dinner table in Pilsen and a warm hand turning over in his, and the specific terror of caring about someone in a world where caring was an exposed position. He thought about the envelope on his desk and didn't open it. He thought about trust. Sarah Marsh had been covering organized crime in Chicago for 11 years, which meant she had developed, over those years, a specific skill set that included reading rooms, reading silences, reading the particular quality of someone's lateral vision when they were watching for something without wanting to appear to be watching. She was 36, originally from Wisconsin, and she had a reputation in her industry for patience and for the kind of sources who stayed sources because she protected them with a rigor that had twice cost her stories she could have run sooner. She had approached Elena Vasquez 6 weeks earlier, after the first reports of changes in the Bridgeport protection arrangements had started reaching her through the neighborhood contacts she'd spent years cultivating. She had not told Elena everything she knew, because she never told sources everything she knew. It was a professional principle, not a personal one. The same principle a doctor might apply in not telling a patient more than was useful to manage. What she'd told Elena was enough, that the changes in the neighborhood were significant, that they were connected to the Moretti organization, and that she was building a longer story about the transition of organized crime operations in Chicago from traditional protection models toward quasi-legitimate business structures. She had not expected Elena to know Dante Moretti personally. That information had arrived in their third conversation, not as a revelation. Elena was not the kind of person who delivered revelations, but as a matter-of-fact disclosure, accompanied by the kind of careful, forthright honesty that Marsh recognized immediately as the voice of a woman who had made a decision to be transparent. "I've met him," Eleanor said. "He's come to the centre. We've talked." A pause. "I want to be clear. I haven't shared any information with him about our conversations. I haven't asked him questions on your behalf. I want you to understand that I'm talking to you because I care about the neighbourhood and about what transparency means for the people who live there, not because I'm a conduit between you and him." Marsh had respected this. She continued to respect it. What she was less certain about, and this was the thing keeping her at her desk on a Thursday afternoon with a cold cup of coffee and a contact sheet for the Moretti organization's known associates, was what Elena Vasquez actually understood about the position she was in. Because the position from Marsh's perspective was this: Dante Moretti appeared to be making significant structural changes to his organization's operations. Those changes were real and had concrete effects on real people in real neighborhoods. Whether those changes were strategic, a controlled, PR-managed retreat from exposed operations, or whether they represented something more genuine, was a question she couldn't yet answer from the evidence she had. And somewhere in the middle of that unanswered question was a woman with a yellow door and a mural commission and a warming conviction that the man visiting her community centre was capable of being better than what he'd been. Marsh picked up her phone and called her editor. "The Bridgeport piece," she said. "I think I need more time." "How much more?" She thought about Elena Vasquez painting crown moulding on a ladder in her community centre, singing to a brass band she thought no one could hear. She thought about the thing that was clearly happening between that woman and Dante Moretti, and what it would mean for both of them when it became visible to the people who needed to manage it. She found it out not from Marsh, not from Dante, but from Dolores at the alterations shop, who had heard something from someone who had heard something from someone. The specific mechanics of neighborhood information exchange that move at a velocity that no formal system can replicate. "People are talking," Dolores said, handing Elena a cup of the strong, sweet coffee she brewed behind the counter every morning. "About you and—" She made the careful gesture that people in the neighborhood made instead of saying the name. "People are noticing, and people are worried for you." Elena sat with this. Worried how? Dolores looked at her steadily over the rim of her own cup. She was 67, had been in this neighborhood for 40 years, had watched its seasons and its power arrangements with the attention of a woman who understood that wisdom was mostly pattern recognition. "There are other people," she said carefully. "Not the ones who've been part of the arrangements here. Other people, from outside. And when those people see something that looks like a weak point—" She stopped. "I'm not a weak point," Elena said. "Of course not." Dolores set down her cup. "But they don't know that." Elena walked back to the centre afterward, through the December cold, and thought about the conversation and what it implied. She was not afraid, but she understood now, more specifically, more physically than she had before, that she was standing in proximity to something that had consequences in directions she couldn't entirely see. She texted Dante. "Can we talk? Not a date, just can we talk?" His response came in 4 minutes. "Tonight, 8 o'clock. I'll come to you. She looked at the message for a long moment. Then she put her phone in her pocket and went inside through the yellow door, and the warmth of the building met her, the warmth of the furnace that his HVAC company had fixed, and she stood in it for a moment and felt the specific weight of the question she was going to have to ask and what his answer would mean. He came at 8 o'clock exactly. The centre was empty at this hour. The last GED class had ended at 7:30, and Amara had locked up the main hall and left. Elena was in the back office behind the filing cabinets, at the desk she'd cleared of Gerald Hooper's accumulated years of unfiled things, with a cup of tea and the December dark pressing at the windows, when she heard him at the yellow door. She let him in and led him to the office without ceremony, and sat down across from him at the desk and said, "Tell me what's actually happening. All of it. As much of it as you can tell me. And stay honest." He sat in the visitor's chair across from her desk, a cheap institutional chair that he occupied with the same contained gravity he'd brought to every space she'd seen him in. And he looked at her with those winter water eyes, and she watched him make a decision. "What do you know?" he asked. "I know people in the neighbourhood are worried about my visibility," she said. "I know there are other organisations, not yours, who might see me as something they can use." She paused. "I know there's a Tribune reporter named Sarah Marsh who has been talking to me, and I know you probably know that too." His expression didn't change in any dramatic way, but she had become attuned to the micro shifts, the slight tension around his eyes that meant she'd said something that landed. "How long have you been talking to her?" 6 weeks. She approached me. I've been honest with her about the neighbourhood and about what the changes in the protection arrangements mean for the people here. I've been careful not to give her operational information I don't have, and I've been clear that I'm not a source for anything that hurts specific people. She held his gaze. "And I should have told you, earlier, that she'd approached me. I thought about it and I decided not to, and I'm not entirely sure I made the right call." "Why didn't you?" he asked. No accusation in it, genuine curiosity. "Because I didn't want it to look like I was protecting you," she said. "And because I wasn't sure." She stopped. This was the hard one. "I wasn't sure if you'd tell me the truth about why you didn't want me talking to her. Whether it was because it was actually dangerous or because it was inconvenient." He was quiet for a moment. "Both," he said. "The honest answer is both." He leaned forward slightly. "The reporter. It's not about the story she's building. A story at this stage is a complication, not a crisis. It's about visibility, about the people who are watching the changes I'm making and looking for a way to read them as weakness. If you're connected to a Tribune investigation into my organization and I'm connected to you, then I become a liability," she said. "You become a target," he said. The word landed with its full weight. "Not from me, never from me, but from people who want to use the situation, use us to pressure me into stopping what I'm doing." He paused. "There's a man named Carmine Bruno in New York who is currently deciding whether I'm in a position he should exploit." She absorbed this. "Are you?" He looked at her steadily. "I'm in the most complicated position I've been in 20 years, he said. "I'm trying to dismantle something I've spent 15 years building in an environment that does not reward dismantling, while—" He stopped. Something moved across his face, something more unguarded than he usually permitted. "While wanting, very badly, to protect something I haven't figured out how to protect yet." The office was quiet. Outside, Archer Street held its December silence. Colder than November, denser, the kind of cold that compressed sound. The motivational poster with the sunrise was behind her on the wall, and the only way out was through. "What are you protecting?" she asked quietly. He looked at her for a long time. "You know what I'm protecting," he said. She did know. She had known, she thought, since the Saturday painting session, since Pilsen, since the moment he'd walked through her yellow door and moved wooden blocks with Marcus, as if the act of careful construction were something he'd been waiting for a chance to do. She had been holding the knowledge at a careful distance, because knowledge of this kind had weight and consequence, and she was a practical woman who understood that feeling something was not the same as deciding something. "Dante," she said, "I need you to understand something." She held his gaze carefully. "I can handle the complicated. I grew up around complicated. I chose Bridgeport. I chose this job. I don't need to be protected from difficulty." A pause. "What I can't handle is being managed, kept at a careful distance while things happen around me that I don't understand." She leaned forward slightly. "If this is going to be anything, if we're going to be anything, I need to be able to see the whole picture, even when it's ugly." He was very still. "Some of the picture," he said slowly, "is things I can't tell you. Not because I'm managing you, because the information would put you in a different legal category, and that category is one I'll spend everything I have to keep you out of." She understood this. She understood it with the practical intelligence of someone who had grown up in a world where information had different weights depending on who carried it. "Okay," she said. "Then tell me what you can." He told her. Not everything. There were categories he sealed closed with a precision that she respected because she could see it was protective, genuinely protective, not controlling. But he told her about Falcone, about the succession conversations, about the timeline he was working toward. He told her about the year, maybe 18 months that Marco had estimated. He told her about what leaving actually meant, the structures that needed to be built, the arrangements that needed to be transferred, the leverage that needed to be neutralized before he could step back without leaving a vacuum that something worse would fill. He told her about his father, more than he had in Pilsen, about growing up inside the organization the way you grow up inside a family, not always certain where the family ended and the institution began, not always able to see the exit, even when you understood there should be one. She listened with the focused attention that was, he was beginning to understand one of the things he valued most about her. Not passive, not simply receptive, but active, engaged, following the thread of what he was saying and pulling at the parts she needed clarified. She asked good questions. She asked the questions that illuminated rather than the questions that trapped. At 9:30, the tea had gone cold and neither of them had noticed. "Are you afraid?" she asked. "Of Falcone? Of Bruno?" He considered. Cautiously. "They're not people to underestimate." "I don't mean of them," she said. "I mean of the other side, of what you're building toward, of who you'd be if it worked." The question sat in the air between them like a held breath. "Yes," he said, profoundly. He looked at her with an honesty that she felt like a physical thing, like warmth through a window. "I've been exactly this for 20 years. I don't know who I am without it." A pause. I know who I want to be. That's different. She reached across the desk and took his hand, the way he had taken hers in Pilsen, deliberately, without ambiguity. Tell me who you want to be, she said. He looked at their hands and then at her and said, someone who deserves to be in this room. She stood up from her chair and came around the desk, and he stood too, and she was close to him now, close enough that she had to look up slightly to meet his eyes, and what was in his eyes was not the controlled, carefully managed gravity she'd seen in the restaurant or the gala. It was something rawer than that, something that hadn't been fully out in the world in a long time. She kissed him. She initiated it the way she initiated most things, with direct intention and without apology. And he responded the way the structure of him responded to everything, with control that gradually, specifically, became something other than control, something that had been waiting a long time to be something other than control. When they separated, both of them were breathing differently. Okay, she said, against his shoulder. Okay, he agreed. Outside, Archer Street was cold and quiet and still, and somewhere across the city, the mechanisms of power and consequence continued their patient work, and none of it, for this specific hour, was relevant. Winter settled into Chicago with its characteristic commitment. Not the polite, photogenic winter of certain climates, but the full, immovable, grey-white conviction of a Great Lakes January. The kind of cold that informed all your plans and required that you be deliberate about warmth in a way that summer people didn't understand. The centre was busier in January than Eleanor had expected. The after-school numbers were up. She'd added 2 new programs in the fall, a coding class for middle schoolers run by a volunteer from the tech sector, and a nutrition and cooking program that Mrs. Reyes had, with typical authority, essentially taken over, transforming it from Eleanor's vague ambition into a twice-weekly event with a waiting list. The GED program had its best enrollment numbers in the centre's recent history. Deshawn had started a second mural, this one on the exterior south wall, a project he'd applied for a city arts grant to fund and received it, which Elena considered one of the most purely satisfying bureaucratic outcomes she had experienced in her professional life. The shopkeepers on Halstead and Archer were, quietly, not paying the monthly arrangements. This was happening without drama, without confrontation, through the mechanism of a quiet word from certain neighbourhood intermediaries and the subsequent absence of the men who came to collect. Elena knew this, and said nothing about it to anyone except Marco. She had never met Marco, but she had once come to the centre to find him waiting, a compact, watchful man who sat in one of the children's room chairs with the resigned patience of someone who understood that child-sized furniture was his due for conducting this particular meeting, and who had said to her, directly and without excess preamble, "He's working on it. Give him time. And be careful." She had looked at him and said, "I'm always careful." He had looked back at her with something that might, in a different emotional register, have been called respect. "I know," he said. "That's why we're having this conversation instead of a different one." She had thought about that sentence several times since. What she and Dante had was, she catalogued it carefully because she was a practical woman and cataloguing was how she maintained clarity in complicated situations. They were not conducting anything conventional. He came to the centre twice a week, sometimes more, in the evenings after the programmes ended. He came to her apartment once, which was a small, carefully arranged place in Pilsen. She'd moved there in September for the commute to Bridgeport, and because Pilsen's community felt alive in a way she responded to. And he had stood in her kitchen, looking at her bookshelf, with an expression that she recognized as the particular concentration of someone reading a person through their objects. And she'd let him read. He was reading Camus. He had started this in November, working through The Stranger with the focused intensity he brought to contracts and operational plans, as if the novel was something to be understood rather than simply experienced. She had started talking to him about it and discovered, with a pleasure that surprised her in its specificity, that he argued about books the way he argued about everything. Precise, well-sourced, deeply considered, occasionally completely wrong, but willing to be demonstrated wrong by evidence. "Meursault isn't a monster," he said one evening in her kitchen. "He's a man who's been so completely conditioned by his environment that he can't access his own interiority." "That's a very generous reading," she said. "It's an accurate one. It excuses him. It explains him." He looked at her with the particular expression she now recognized as him enjoying the argument. There's a difference. Explanation isn't absolution. She had looked at him for a moment across the kitchen counter, at this man who was working his way through Camus in his 40s because she'd mentioned the book and finding it relevant in ways he was processing carefully and out loud. And she had felt something that settled rather than soared. Not the electric feeling of early interest, but the deeper, quieter sensation of recognizing someone, of thinking, here is a person I want to keep talking to. In January, there was also the night with the car. She had been leaving the centre at 9:30 on a Tuesday, walking to the bus stop 2 blocks away, when she became aware, gradually, then suddenly, that a black SUV had been keeping pace with her from the corner of Halstead. It was not following her in any dramatic sense. It simply existed at the same speed as her walking, 1 block away, moving when she moved. She turned around and went back to the centre. She called Dante. He picked up in 2 rings. She told him, without drama or excess detail, what she'd observed. There was a silence, 5 seconds maybe, and then his voice, controlled and specific. "Go back inside and lock the front door. Don't leave until I call you back. Don't call anyone else." "Dante." "Elena." A pause, and then something softer. "Please." She went inside and locked the yellow door and sat in the office and waited. And 22 minutes later, Marco arrived with a man she hadn't seen before, and they spent 15 minutes on the block, and then Marco came inside and told her, in the concise manner she'd come to expect from him, that the situation was resolved and she could go home. "What was it?" she asked. "Luca Falcone being curious," Marco said. "Not a direct threat, but noted." She thought about this on the cab ride home. The casual deployment of surveillance, the 19-year-old instincts of a man trying to understand what someone meant to someone else, to find the soft place in the architecture of another person's life. She thought about Marco saying "noted," with the particular flatness of someone filing information that would have consequences. She called Dante when she got home. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I'm fine," she said. "I want to know what happened with Marco." He told her, partially. Enough that she understood the Luca situation and what it meant structurally. enough that she could hear, underneath his careful management of the information, the effort it was costing him to keep her at the edge of the thing rather than outside it entirely. "Dante," she said, "how much longer?" A long pause. 6 months, maybe, if things move the way I'm working to move them. 6 months, she said. I know I'm not going anywhere, she said. I'm asking because I want to know. 6 months is fine. 6 months I can work with. A pause. But you need to know something. What? I love you, she said. Simply, without stage dressing, the way she said true things. I'm saying it now so it's established and we don't have to do the cautious dance around it. I love you, and I'm staying, and 6 months is fine. The silence that followed was long enough that she began to wonder if the line had dropped. Elena, he said finally. Yes? I have not said that to anyone in a very long time. His voice was different. She could hear the layers of control working, and somewhere beneath them the actual texture of what he felt. It terrifies me, what it means. I know, she said. Me too. That's how you know it's real. Another silence. I love you, he said. She closed her eyes. Outside, the Pilsen cold pressed at her windows, and the city breathed its January breath, and somewhere the mechanisms kept turning, and she held the phone and felt the warmth of those 3 words as if they were a physical thing, a specific heat, a furnace repaired against the season. It was Marco who found out about the Brennan connection. He brought it to Dante on a Friday morning in February, with the specific gravity of a man carrying information he wished he wasn't carrying. And he laid it out in the precise sequence of events that he'd assembled over 3 weeks of careful investigation. And when he was finished, Dante sat in the chair behind his desk and was very quiet for a long time. The shape of it was this. Luca Falcone, operating outside his father's knowledge or authorization, had made a deal with a remnant of the Brennan crew, the men that Dante had believed were neutralized in November, settled and directed, and no longer relevant. The deal was straightforward in the way that Luca Falcone's ideas were always straightforward, which was to say blunt and effective and completely unconcerned with collateral damage. The Brennan remnant would create an incident in Bridgeport, something visible, something that could be attributed to the gap left by the withdrawal of Moretti protection. And the incident would be used to demonstrate that Dante's transition strategy was creating instability and therefore needed to be reversed or reconsidered under new leadership. The incident, as far as Marco could determine, was intended for the Halstead corridor, which meant the block where the alterations shop was, where Chen's grocery was, where the tamale stand had been standing since 1987, where the people who had started slowly to believe that they could operate without paying for the privilege of operating were going about their ordinary lives, where the community centre, 2 blocks east, was open 6 days a week with a yellow door. When? Dante asked. This weekend, Marco said. Possibly as early as tonight. Dante stood up. Elena, I've already, Marco started. Pull Santos and Reeves. Put them on the centre. Now. Not visible. I don't want her to know the level of this until I talk to her. He was already moving, already making the calls in his head, the sequence of interventions that would need to happen in the next 4 hours. Falcone. Vincent Falcone. I need him on the phone in the next 30 minutes. Dante. Marco's voice had a quality that stopped him. If you call Vincent and tell him what Luca is doing, It ends Luca. Vincent will end him. Yes, Dante said. He's Vincent's son. He's a liability and a threat, and he put civilians in a crosshair because he wanted a lesson in neighborhood governance. Dante looked at his deputy with the absolute, unadorned authority of the man he actually was, stripped of the careful, transitioning, softer version he'd been building. He made it personal, Marco. He made it personal when he put that SUV outside her center. And then he made it considerably more personal when he decided to use the people in her neighborhood as a demonstration. A pause. Call Vincent. The next 3 hours were a particular kind of controlled violence, not physical but structural, the violence of organizations communicating with each other at the level of consequence and authority. Vincent Falcone, once presented with specific evidence of what his son had arranged, was silent for 40 seconds, and then spoke in a voice that Dante had never heard from him before. A voice stripped of the careful elder statesman register he cultivated, something older and colder than that. He said 3 sentences. The 3 sentences were enough. The Brennan remnant was contacted by members of Falcone's own organization. The planned incident was cancelled. The 3 men involved were relocated, not harmed, because Dante had specified that explicitly, and because Vincent Falcone, for all his complexity, understood that the era of certain solutions had passed, but relocated with sufficient clarity about the consequences of reverting that the point required no further elaboration. Luca Falcone was removed from operational responsibilities by his father in a conversation that Dante was not present for and did not ask to be informed about. By 9 o'clock that Friday night, the Halstead corridor was safe in the specific sense that the planned threat to it had been dissolved. Dante sat in his car outside the community center and called Eleanor. "I need to come in," he said. She heard something in his voice. "I'll unlock the door." He found her in the children's room, sitting at the low table where he'd first sat with Marcus, and the murals on the walls were lit by the overhead lights with the colours Deshawn had chosen, deep and rich, and full of a future that wasn't here yet, but was being insistently imagined into possibility. She looked at his face when he walked in, and she stood up. "Tell me," she said. He told her. All of it this time. The Brennan situation, Luca, the specific threat that had existed tonight for her neighborhood and her building. He told her because he had promised that the category of this information was something she had the right to know, and because she would hear some version of it from the neighborhood regardless, and because she was the person he loved, and he was not going to manage her. She listened. Her face was very still throughout, the active stillness of someone processing something large and distributing its weight appropriately. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "The shopkeepers on Halstead," she said. "Are they okay?" "They're fine. They don't know anything happened tonight." She exhaled slowly. "Dolores," she said. "Mrs. Reyes, Mr. Chen." She said the names like a kind of accounting, checking them off. "They're all okay." "Yes," he said. "They're all okay." She looked at him for a moment, with an expression that contained somehow all of the complexity of what they were, what he was, what she knew about it, what she'd chosen, what it cost her to have chosen it, and underneath all of it, steady and warm and terrifyingly real, the thing that remained after everything else was accounted for. "Come here," she said. He crossed the room, and she put her arms around him, which required her to reach up slightly, and he put his around her, and they stood in the children's room, surrounded by the murals of a future someone was trying to paint into existence, and he held her with the specific quality of a man holding something he understands to be precious and fragile and worth every risk. 6 months, she said, against his chest. 6 months, he said. Then what? He pressed his lips to her hair. Then, he said, we figure out who I am next. March came to Chicago with the particular insolence of a Great Lakes spring, not gentle, not gradual, not the soft, incremental warming of southern climates, but sudden and contradictory, a week of 50-degree sunshine, followed by a blizzard, followed by weather that felt genuinely apologetic about the blizzard. The city responded with its characteristic pragmatism, shedding winter gear with the aggressive optimism of people who had earned the right to be warm. The South Wall mural was completed in early March, on a weekend when the temperature climbed to 54, and Deshawn set up scaffolding on the exterior and worked for 6 hours straight, and a small crowd gathered on the sidewalk to watch the final panels emerge. Elena stood on the sidewalk with Mrs. Reyes and a thermos of coffee, and felt something that was not easily named. Not pride exactly, though pride was in it, and not just happiness, though happiness was there too. Something more like recognition, like watching a thing become what it had always been trying to be. "It looks like us," said Marcus, who was standing next to her with his hands in his pockets in the manner of a 9-year-old pretending not to be impressed by something that impressed him enormously. "That's because it is you," Elena said. "Deshawn painted real people. That's Mrs. Aguilar in that panel there, and Mr. Guzman from the tamale stand, and—" She paused. "That's you, actually. The boy with the block tower." Marcus looked at the mural. The boy in it was painted with the kind of careful, particular attention that meant Deshawn had observed him specifically. The jacket that was slightly too large, the focused expression of construction, the blocks arranged with increasing architectural intelligence. Marcus was quiet for a long time. "It's a good tower," he said finally. "It's a great tower," Elena said. Dante came that afternoon. He came because she'd sent him a photograph of the mural as it was being finished, and the photograph had been accompanied by no text, just the image. And the image had done something to him that he was still working to articulate when he pulled up to the center and got out and stood on the sidewalk and looked at it. The mural was 30 feet across and 12 feet high, and it was extraordinary. Not in the superlative way of technically accomplished public art, though it was that, but in the specific way of something made with complete conviction about its subject. The neighborhood's past and present and imagined future, painted in colors that were generous without being sentimental. Figures rendered with enough individuality that you could tell Deshawn had looked at each one long enough to see them. The tamale stand, the alterations shop window, children, elders, the specific, irreducible texture of people who lived in a place and made it mean something by living there. In the corner of the rightmost panel, the future panel, the not yet, a figure that he looked at for a long time, tall, contained, standing in the neighborhood, not above it, not adjacent to it, but in it, facing the same direction as everyone else. He didn't say anything when Elena came out to stand beside him. He just looked at the mural for a while. "He painted everyone who's been part of the center's life this year," she said. People who've donated, volunteered, helped. He painted me, Dante said. You painted an east wall, she said. That counts. He looked at the figure in the corner of the future panel. Something moved across his face, something she had learned to recognize as the specific expression he wore when he was feeling something he hadn't anticipated feeling and was deciding in real time to let it exist without controlling it. Elena, he said. Yes? I want to show you something. He turned to her. On Saturday, there's somewhere I want to take you. She looked at him with the assessing gaze that he found, still, 6 months into knowing her, consistently valuable. Because she assessed things accurately. She didn't reassess them to be less than they were to make herself more comfortable. Okay, she said. Saturday was the first genuinely warm day of the year. He drove her to a house in Evanston, not his, not yet, not in any legal sense connected to him. A Victorian house on a tree-lined street 2 blocks from the lake, with a front porch and tall windows and a garden that had been allowed to go slightly wild over a recent winter of inattention. It had been on the market for 60 days. He had been thinking about it for 45. He parked in front of it, and they sat in the car for a moment and looked at the house. It's beautiful, she said. It's a project, he said. The kitchen needs to be completely redone. The garden needs... He paused. I've been reading about gardens. She turned to look at him. You've been reading about gardens? On my phone, late at night. There are apparently entire schools of thought about what to do with a neglected Victorian garden. Restoration versus contemporary intervention versus... Dante. She was looking at him with an expression that contained, he was almost certain, a laugh being deliberately restrained for the sake of his dignity. Are you telling me you've been lying awake at 3 a.m, reading garden design? I'm telling you the window situation has improved, he said. I'm looking at things differently at 3 a.m. She took his hand. They sat looking at the house for another minute, the porch, the wild garden, the tall windows with their promise of good light. What are you showing me? She asked quietly. Knowing, he thought, but asking anyway. A possible life, he said, after. What after might look like. He turned to face her. I wanted you to see it, whether or not, whatever you decide. I wanted you to see that I've been picturing an after, specifically. She was quiet for a moment, that felt like many things happening at once inside her. Then she got out of the car and walked up the front path and onto the porch and turned around to look at the garden from above it, the way you looked at a garden when you were thinking about what it could become. And she had her hand above her eyes against the spring sun, and she was... Luminous, he thought, was still the wrong word, but he was running out of better ones. The porch needs repainting, she called down. I know, he said. He had gotten out of the car and was standing on the path. Yellow? She said. He looked at her on the porch in the spring light, and he felt the thing he'd been feeling for 6 months, but had not let himself fully inhabit until this moment. The specific, terrifying, entirely unprecedented feeling of wanting something that was not power or control or the management of risk, but was simply this. This woman on a porch in the sun, this garden, this ordinary, extraordinary life. Whatever colour you want, he said. April arrived, and with it the thing Dante had been waiting for, the thing Marco had been waiting for, came through the shape of an offer from Carmine Bruno in New York. Dante had expected it. He had not expected the specific shape of it. The offer, communicated through a series of intermediaries in the careful, indirect manner that men like Bruno preferred, was this. Dante would step back from day-to-day operations. A transition committee, Bruno's people, 2 Falcone lieutenants, a representative from a St. Louis organization that had been quietly expanding its Chicago interests, would oversee the organization during a period of, Bruno suggested, restructuring. In exchange, Dante would be permitted to exit with his legitimate assets intact, with no claim against his person, and with the understanding that his outside interests, the phrase with its careful vagueness clearly referred to Elena, would remain undisturbed. The words would remain undisturbed did the specific work of reminding him that the disturbance was currently within the power of the people making this offer. He read the offer in his office on a Tuesday morning. He set it down and went to the window, the north window, the lake view, the grey April sky, and stood there for 20 minutes. Then he called Marco in. "No," he said. Marco closed the door. "Dante, the transition they're proposing gives Bruno's people operational control of the Chicago corridor within 18 months, maybe 12. Falcone would be managed out within 2 years. Everything I've built goes to people who will run it the way it was run 30 years ago." He turned from the window. The merchants on Halstead, who've been free for 4 months, go back on the arrangement. The centre's donation gets unwound through channels. Everything I've been doing gets reversed. He looked at Marco steadily. "No." "Then what?" Marco asked. "What's the play? I need something that makes stepping back my choice, not theirs. Something that gives me a negotiating position strong enough that when I leave, and I am leaving, the terms are mine." Marco sat down. He had the look of a man doing calculations very fast. "The federal thing," he said. Dante looked at him. "The federal investigation that's been building for 2 years. Marco said carefully. "The one we've been working around. The one that's been looking at Bruno's New York operations and the Chicago connection." He paused. "There's a federal prosecutor named Chen who's been after the New York end for 18 months. If the right information found its way to the right place. I won't put federal targets on civilians," Dante said. "I'm not suggesting civilians." Marco's voice was precise. "I'm suggesting that if the investigation pivots toward Bruno's financial operations, specifically the legitimate-looking shell structures he's been using, and if that investigation produces results that make Bruno's position untenable, then the conversation about Chicago succession becomes irrelevant, because Bruno is the one driving it." A long pause. "And the information that would make that pivot possible exists. You have it. You've had it for 3 years." Dante was very still. "It would have consequences for you, too," Marco said, "using it. The relationship with the federal office. I know." He turned back to the window. "Get me Chen's contact." "And Falcone?" "Vincent is not the problem. Vincent has always understood the direction things need to go. He just needed time and a reason." Dante's voice was measured, each word considered. "The removal of Bruno as a pressure point is the reason." He turned to Marco. "Set up the meeting. And Marco, nobody outside this room. Not yet." "Understood." After Marco left, Dante sat at his desk for a long time. He thought about what he was doing with the clear-eyed precision that the moment required, not rationalizing, not performing virtue, but actually thinking through what it meant. He was going to provide information that would result in federal legal consequences for Carmine Bruno and his organization. This was not a decision he made lightly, and it was not a decision made from moral simplicity. Bruno was a criminal. So was Dante. The difference, he told himself, was the difference that mattered. Bruno was threatening civilians, threatening the specific people in his neighborhood that Eleanor had spent a year building towards something better, threatening Eleanor herself by implication, and doing it in service of an expansion of operations that would make everything worse for everyone below the level of the men making the decisions. Dante was trying to make things better in the imperfect, compromised, complicated way that was the only way available to him. He picked up his phone and texted Eleanor, "Can I come tonight?" Her response, "Marcus's volcano finally erupted today. It was magnificent." "Yes, come." He smiled, an unguarded, private smile, not a managed expression, and put his phone down and went back to work. That evening, she told him about the volcano and the chemistry of baking soda and vinegar with the enthusiasm of a woman who had spent a year learning to love each specific small victory in a job full of them. And he listened with the full presence that she had learned to recognize as one of the things she loved most about him. The way he made listening look like something he actively chose, not something that happened by default. They were in her apartment on the couch, and she had her feet pulled up under her and a glass of wine, and the ease between them had a quality that she sometimes lost her breath acknowledging. The ease of two people who have decided, without any formal declaration of the decision, to be home to each other. "Something is happening," she said. Not a question. She had learned to read his particular quality of control, the specific containment of a man managing something significant. "Yes," he said. "Can you tell me?" He told her the shape of it carefully. The offer from Bruno, his answer, the decision about the federal investigation. He told her without the operational details she didn't need and shouldn't have, but with enough that she understood what was happening and what it meant. That the end game he'd been building toward was arriving faster than he'd planned. That the next several months were going to be the most dangerous of the process. That there was a real possibility of things going sideways in ways he was working to prevent. She listened through all of it. When he was done, she was quiet for a moment. Then, "After this, after Bruno, after the federal thing, after whatever happens in the next few months, what does your legal exposure look like, honestly?" He looked at her. "Honest answer? That's the only kind I take from you." "My legal exposure, if the federal investigation goes where I intend it to go, will require a very good lawyer and possibly some form of negotiated arrangement. Not immunity, I don't qualify for immunity, but a defined, bounded consequence rather than an open-ended one." He paused. "Marco has been talking to an attorney for 6 months, working on a framework." She nodded slowly, absorbing this. "So this might mean, even after everything, there could be—" "A consequence," he said. "Yes, possibly. I'm not going to tell you it's clean on the other side, because it isn't. It's cleaner. That's what I can promise." She looked at him for a long time, and what he saw in her face was not what he'd feared. Not retreat, not the recalibration toward distance that would have been, in his experience, the rational response to what he'd just described. It was something else. It was the look of a woman taking inventory, accurately and without sentimentality, of exactly what she was choosing, and choosing it anyway. "Okay," she said. "Let's get to cleaner." He reached for her hand. The federal investigation pivoted in May. It pivoted through the mechanism of information provided through channels so carefully constructed that the information's origin was legally insulated. Passed through a series of intermediaries, including Marco's attorney contact and a former federal investigator who had developed, over 20 years, a specialized practice in exactly this kind of careful transfer. What arrived at the office of Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Chen was a documented account of the financial architecture behind Carmine Bruno's Chicago interests, the shell structures, the movement of funds, the specific connections between nominally legitimate development ventures and operations that were not, when examined with the right technical tools, legitimate at all. Chen was thorough. She was also, which was relevant, specifically interested in the financial architecture rather than in the street-level operations, which meant the investigation that expanded from her office in May moved with the precision of something targeting infrastructure rather than individuals at the organizational margins. It moved toward Bruno. It moved necessarily away from Chicago. Dante watched this from a careful distance, through Marco and through the attorney, and said nothing, and waited. Vincent Falcone called him on a Thursday. "I hear there are interesting developments in New York," Falcone said. "I hear the same things," Dante said. A pause. "Carmine is going to have a complicated summer." "It seems that way." "This changes the conversation about Chicago," Falcone said. "The succession discussion—" "Vincent," Dante said, "I want to have a real conversation, not through intermediaries, not at Serafina's, at my office, this week." "I can do Friday," Falcone said. Falcone came to the Varro Tower on Friday afternoon, and this time it was just the two of them. No bodyguards in the room, which was either an expression of trust or the recognition that the power arrangement had shifted sufficiently that the demonstration of security was no longer relevant. Dante wasn't certain which, and he found that he didn't particularly care. "I want a clear exit," Dante said, "not the kind Bruno was proposing, a real one. I transfer day-to-day operational oversight to a structure that you and I design together over the next 4 months. The Moretti name stays attached to the legitimate businesses, the real estate development, the South Loop Foundation, the hospitality group. The other arrangements—" He paused. "The other arrangements transition to something that I'm no longer personally connected to. And I'm out." Falcone looked at him across the desk. The afternoon light through the north window fell across his silver hair and made him look for a moment like the younger version of himself, the man who'd been Dante's father's contemporary, who'd built his own architecture in this city over a lifetime. "Why now?" he asked. "Really?" Dante thought about the honest answer. He thought about Pilsen, and a hand turning over in his, and a mural on a south wall, and a house in Evanston with a porch that needed painting. He thought about the thing he'd said to Elena in the children's room. "Someone who deserves to be in this room." "Because I'm done becoming what I've been," he said. "And I want the time to become something else." Falcone studied him for a long moment. Something moved through the older man's expression, an evaluation, and beneath it, something that might have been recognition. "The woman," he said. "The woman is part of it,"
Dante said. Not the only part, but part of it. Falcone nodded slowly. She knows what she's into? She knows everything relevant. And she stayed. She stayed. Falcone was quiet for a moment. My wife, he said, has been telling me for 15 years to get out. Every year I tell her 1 more year. He picked up the glass of water on the desk. Dante's office had the small, specific hospitality touches of a space designed to make guests comfortable without being obvious about it, and held it for a moment. I didn't have a yellow door. Dante looked at him. Marco told me, Falcone said, with a trace of something that wasn't quite a smile. About the centre, the door, a pause. He's worried about you, you know, in the way that men like Marco worry about people they've spent 11 years keeping alive. I know, Dante said. He's also, and don't tell him I said this, considerably relieved. Falcone set down the water. The 4 months, that's the timeline? End of September, Dante said. Clean. I'll need something in the structure that protects the Chicago operations during transition. Stability, no vacuum. I've been thinking about that. Dante opened the folder on his desk. I have a proposal. They talked for 2 hours. The conversation was, in its way, the most straightforward one they'd had in 15 years. 2 men who understood each other's interests, negotiating openly because the usual strategic concealment had become less relevant than the actual outcome. When Falcone left, he shook Dante's hand for the first time, and the handshake meant what it was supposed to mean. Marco came back into the office as soon as Falcone's car left the building. How did it go? September, Dante said. Marco exhaled. It was not a dramatic exhalation. Marco was not a dramatic man, but it carried the weight of 11 years and the specific relief of someone who had been watching a man walk a knife's edge and was finally seeing the blade begin to move towards something less lethal. September, Marco said. I need to make a call, Dante said. He was already reaching for his phone. Marco understood and went back to his own office. Elena's phone rang at 4:30 in the afternoon. She was in the children's room, supervising the Thursday Science Club, and she stepped into the hall to answer. September, Dante said. Falcone agreed. September is the exit timeline. She stood in the hall of the community centre with her hand against the wall and her eyes closed, and she felt 4 months, the weight of them, the reality of them, the possibility on the other side of them, land in her chest with the specific force of something she'd been holding at arm's length, finally being allowed to approach. 4 months, she said. 4 months, he said. Okay, she breathed. Okay. I'm going to go back in because Marcus is trying to introduce variables into the experiment that aren't in the protocol. Of course he is. And I'm going to see you tonight, and we're going to talk about all of this properly. Yes. And Dante. She stopped. Yes. September, she said. I'll be counting. The summer was the strangest of his adult life. Not strange in the register of crisis. The Bruno situation was moving through the federal machinery with the deliberate institutional pace of complex financial investigations, and the Chicago transition was progressing according to the timeline he and Falcone had agreed, and nothing catastrophic was happening. The strangeness was something else.
It was the strangeness of a man who had spent 20 years living at perpetual operational altitude, beginning for the first time to descend. He spent more time in Bridgeport, not at the centre only, in the neighbourhood, on the streets, at Mr. Chen's grocery, where he bought coffee most mornings he was on Archer Street, at the tamale stand, where Mr. Guzman had been selling from the same spot for 37 years, and who had, over the course of the summer, moved from the careful, contained acknowledgement that the neighbourhood had always given Dante to something that occupied the territory between grudging respect and genuine warmth. They talked about the Cubs, mostly. Mr. Guzman had opinions about the bullpen that he delivered with the authority of a man who had been having opinions about the Cubs for 4 decades and saw no reason to moderate them. He went to the garden in Evanston on weekends. He had bought the house in June, bought it through a development company, clean and legitimate, the paperwork and the structure exactly what it appeared to be. He had been, as he'd told Elena, reading about gardens, and the reading had expanded into consultation with an actual garden designer, a woman named Rachel who had the practical, unflappable manner of someone who treated neglected Victorian gardens as interesting challenges rather than disasters. He had told Rachel what he wanted, something that connected to the original Victorian bones of the garden, but had room to grow, to change, to be actively used rather than preserved. Rachel had looked at the garden and then at him and said, "Are you planning to actually be in this garden? Because if so, that changes the plant selection significantly." "I plan to be in it a lot," he said. "Good," she said, in the tone of someone who found most of her clients insufficiently committed to inhabiting their own gardens. Elena came to the house on weekends when she could. She was in the middle of a significant expansion of the after-school program, a grant-funded addition that had doubled the enrollment and required hiring 2 part-time staff members and reorganizing the entire programming schedule, and her energy during the week was comprehensively spoken for. But Saturday afternoons in Evanston became a rhythm. The house, the garden in various states of becoming, the porch where he'd put 2 chairs and where she fell asleep reading with reliable frequency in the July heat, the afternoons that stretched into evenings, and the evenings that stretched into the specific domestic hours that felt to him like a kind of instruction in what life was supposed to be. He was learning, in his 40s, how to be present in time that had no strategic purpose. The afternoons on the porch had no deliverable. The conversations about the garden and the cubs and what colour to paint the kitchen. Elena had strong opinions about the kitchen, specifically about the backsplash, which she believed should be a specific shade of terracotta that he'd initially considered garish and had come, over the course of several weekends, to understand she was correct about. None of it produced anything except the thing itself, the experience of being in time with another person, without agenda. He had not understood before that this was something a person could want more than power. In August, there was a complication. It arrived in the form of Sarah Marsh's article, which had been in development for 6 months and ran in the Tribune on a Sunday in the 3rd week of August under the headline, "The Quiet Revolution on Halstead: How Chicago's Bridgeport neighborhood reclaimed its streets." The article was, in the event, not what Dante had feared it would be. Marsh had written about the neighborhood, about the changes in the protection arrangements, about the community center's role, about the merchants and their slowly recovering sense of agency, about what the article carefully described as a shift in the informal power structures that have governed the area for decades. She had not named Dante directly. She had not named Elena as a source. She had written about the neighborhood with the attention of someone who had been listening to it for a long time. And the story she told was genuinely and primarily the neighborhood's story, which was, Elena told him when they talked about it that Sunday morning, what she'd been hoping for. "She's good at her job," Elena said. They were on the porch in Evanston with coffee and the Sunday paper, and she was reading the article for the third time with the critical attention she gave to things she'd been involved in. She protected everyone who needed protecting, and she told the real story. The real story, Dante said, the neighborhood finding its feet. Eleanor looked at him over the paper. "That's the real story. You're a supporting character." "I've been called worse," he said. She laughed, the full, unguarded laugh he'd first seen through the windows of the centre, the one that still, 8 months later, did something specific to the temperature of whatever room he was in when he heard it. "The porch paint," she said. "We never decided." "Yellow," he said. She lowered the paper and looked at him with an expression that he had learned was the expression she wore when something landed somewhere true. "Yellow," she agreed. September was coming. He could feel it in the quality of the August light, the particular angle of late summer that had begun to acknowledge the autumn's existence without conceding to it. The long, golden afternoons that were slightly less long than they'd been in July. He had a meeting with Marco on a Monday, a review of the transition timeline. Everything was on schedule. The organizational structure he and Falcone had agreed on was in place and had been tested through July and August with the smaller operational decisions, things that had previously flowed through Dante's office, now routing through the new structure without meaningful disruption. The Bruno federal situation was progressing. There had been 3 grand jury subpoenas and a search of 2 corporate offices in June. And Bruno's operation was currently too absorbed with its own legal problems to be concerned with Chicago succession conversations. "End of September," Marco confirmed. "We're on track." Dante sat at his desk and felt the strange, specific quality of a man approaching the end of something. Not a death, but a completion, the closing of a chapter so long it had felt like the whole book. "Marco," he said, "after September, what are you doing?" Marco looked at him with the expression of a man who had been thinking about this for considerably longer than Dante probably knew. "I have some things I've been looking at," he said carefully. "Legitimate, boring. Security consulting for businesses, the legal kind, where you assess vulnerabilities and write reports and nobody gets—" He paused. "Nobody does anything that requires the kind of management I've been doing for 11 years. "That sounds right for you," Dante said. "Does it?" Marco looked at him with genuine inquiry. "I spent 11 years keeping you alive. I don't entirely know what I'm useful for without the specific requirements of the job." "You're useful," Dante said, "for the same thing you've always been useful for. Seeing things clearly and saying them directly." He paused. "The security consulting. Good. I know people in that sector. I'll make introductions." Marco looked at him for a moment. "You're going to be okay," he said. It was not a question, but it had the quality of something that had been held for a long time before being spoken. "Yes," Dante said. "I think I actually am." September arrived the way Chicago Septembers do, brilliantly, briefly, with the concentrated beauty of a season making its best argument before the long grey withdrawal of autumn. The lake went a specific shade of blue in September that it didn't achieve at any other time of year. A deep, clarified blue that had something of winter's seriousness without winter's coldness. And on the clear days, you could see all the way to the horizon, and the horizon was just water and sky and nothing else, which was either lonely or liberating, depending on who you were when you looked at it. Dante signed the final transition documents on the 22nd of September. He signed them in his office on the 38th floor, with Marco beside him and the attorney who'd been building the framework for 8 months, and a notary who was professional and efficient and did not ask what the documents meant in the larger sense, which was appropriate because the document's larger sense was not something that fit in the category of legally representable reality. What they were, in their specific legal terms, was the formal transfer of his operational role in the Moretti organization's legitimate holdings and the establishment of a board structure for ongoing governance. What they were, in every other sense, was the end of a chapter that had consumed 20 years of his life. He signed them with a steady hand, because he had always had a steady hand, and then he sat for a moment in the quiet of his office and let the significance of the moment exist without immediately moving past it. "That's it?" he asked Marco. "That's it," Marco said. He looked around the office, the north window, the desk, the 2 chairs where Falcone had sat across from him on the day they'd finally had a direct conversation, the bookshelf where he'd lined the Camus and, more recently, 2 volumes of garden history that Rachel had recommended and which he'd read with genuine interest. He had started here at 26. He had made decisions in this room that had shaped the lives of people in ways he could not fully account for, some of those ways good and some not. And the accounting was something he intended to spend a long time doing carefully, not as punishment, but as the honest work of a man who believed that knowing what you'd done was part of knowing who to be next. He picked up his phone and called Elena. "Done," he said when she answered. She was quiet for a moment. He could hear the sounds of the centre in the background, a child's voice somewhere, and what sounded like Mrs. Reyes issuing instructions in a tone that brooked no dissent. "Come to the centre," Elena said. "We're celebrating Marcus's birthday. He's 10 today, and he made a specific request for your presence at the cake cutting." He felt something move through his chest, warm and specific, and not complicated at all. "I'll be there in 40 minutes. He took the elevator down to the lobby of the Varro Tower and walked out onto the street and stood for a moment on the sidewalk in the September afternoon. The city moved around him, the ordinary, continuous, magnificent business of a city in motion, people going places, cars and buses, the smell of the lake on the west wind, the sound of a jackhammer somewhere constructing something. He had lived in this city his whole life, and it had been, for most of that life, a map of positions and leverage points and arrangements, a geography of power. He was standing in it now, and it was just a city, beautiful and difficult and full of people trying to get somewhere. He started walking toward the parking garage. He would drive to Bridgeport. He would eat cake at Marcus's birthday party, and the 10-year-old would show him whatever structural innovation he'd arrived at since the block tower, and Mrs. Reyes would press food on him, and Elena would look at him from across the room with the specific look she gave things she'd decided were worth knowing. He would be present in time that had no strategic purpose, and he would be, the word he arrived at was not one he'd used about himself in 20 years, if ever, he would be free, or something close enough to it that the distance was workable. The birthday party occupied the entire main hall and spilled into the children's room because Marcus had apparently cultivated friendships with a significant proportion of the after-school program, and Elena had decided that the appropriate response to a 10-year-old turning 10 was to make the celebration large enough to match the event. Mrs. Reyes had made a cake that was, technically, 3 cakes in the shape of a building, which Marcus had declared was a skyscraper, and which everyone had agreed was the ideal shape for a cake belonging to a person interested in structural integrity. Dante ate his cake at a table with Marcus and 2 of Marcus's friends, and listened to an extended conversation about whether a building could be made of entirely hexagonal rooms, and was beginning to form an actual opinion about the structural implications when he felt Elena's hand on his shoulder. He turned. She was beside him, her hand warm through his shirt, looking at him with the particular expression, the one that had no management in it, the one that was simply her face, saying what it felt. "Hey," she said quietly, under the noise of the room. "Hey," he said. "You okay?" He looked at her. He looked at the room, the children and the murals on the wall, and the north-facing windows with the autumn light coming in, and Mrs. Reyes cutting another slice of skyscraper cake with the authority of a woman who understood that hospitality was a form of love. He thought about 20 years, and what they'd cost, and what they'd built, and who he'd been, and who, starting now, he was going to be instead. "Yes," he said, "for the first time in a long time. Genuinely, yes." She squeezed his shoulder and sat down beside him, and Marcus immediately redirected his hexagonal building theory to include her in the audience, and she engaged with it with the full, focused generosity that was so specifically her that Dante had stopped, months ago, trying to describe it and had simply accepted it as a fact of the world, like the September colour of the lake, like the weight of a hand in yours, like the feeling of a furnace coming on in a cold building and warmth moving through all the rooms. They drove to Evanston that evening. The porch had been painted in late August, yellow, the specific shade Elena had chosen, which proved to be exactly right for the Victorian bones of the house and the garden that was taking shape around it. Rachel's patient work visible in the new beds and the salvaged perennials and the vine that was claiming the south fence with patient determination. The evening was cool and clear, and the September dark came early and gently, and they sat on the porch in the 2 chairs and watched the garden in the last of the light. "Tell me something you want," Elena said. They had a habit by now of this, of asking each other things directly, instead of waiting for the information to arrive through inference. It had been her practice first, and he had adopted it, finding that it suited him better than he'd expected. He thought about it, honestly. "To be here," he said, "this specific place, with you, for—" he paused. "For a long time." "That's not very specific," she said. "You're usually more precise." "For the rest," he said. "Is that specific enough?" She was quiet for a moment, looking at the garden in the dark, the vine on the fence, the beds where things were sleeping that would come back in spring. "For the rest," she repeated. "Yes," he said. She turned to look at him in the dark, and he could see her face in the light from the front window, the directness, the warmth, the woman who had walked into a cold building in Bridgeport and decided it was worth heating. The woman who had painted a door yellow because she wanted the building to be impossible to ignore. The woman who had looked at him, at what he was, and what he'd been, and what the distance was between those two things, and decided, with clear eyes and full information, that the distance was workable. "For the rest, then," she said. He reached across and took her hand. The garden was quiet. The city, somewhere beyond the trees, was making its ordinary nocturnal sounds. The vine on the south fence moved slightly in the September breeze, which was either restlessness or growth. He had been reading enough garden history by now to understand that in plants the two things were often the same. He thought about the window at 3 in the morning, the Barolo he couldn't drink, the edge and the void he'd imagined beyond it. He had been wrong about the void. There was no void on the other side, no nothing, no falling. There was this. There was a porch and a woman and a garden trying to become what it was meant to be, and the long, patient, entirely imperfect work of a life moving in the direction of its own redemption. The wolves in the old stories he'd read once were not the monsters the stories made them. They were animals of enormous intelligence and fierce loyalty, who had been given the wrong mythology, the wrong role in the wrong narrative, and had lived inside that narrative so long they'd forgotten it wasn't the only story available. He had spent 41 years living inside the wrong story. He was, finally, beginning to write another one. In October, the Tribune published a follow-up piece about the Bridgeport Community Centre's expanded programs and the record enrollment in its fall after-school sessions. The article included a photograph of the South Wall mural, Deshawn's future panel, the one that imagined the neighbourhood as it could be, and the photograph ran on the front page of the Metro section, which was, Elena told Dante when she showed him, the kind of thing that could happen when you painted a door yellow and refused to be ignorable. In November, the federal case against Carmine Bruno's financial operations resulted in indictments on 12 counts. Bruno's Chicago interests, the transition plans, the succession conversations, dissolved into the fog of legal consequence. In December, Elena moved to Evanston. She kept her desk at the community center, which she visited 6 days a week, because a building could be your home and your work at the same time, which was something she'd understood about the center for a while and was only now beginning to understand about herself. Marco opened his security consulting practice in January. His first client was a mid-sized Chicago real estate company whose principal investor, for reasons that were not discussed, had taken a particular interest in ensuring the firm operated with integrity. Marcus turned 11 in the following September and built for the occasion a scale model of the community centre from balsa wood and hot glue that was structurally impeccable and which Elena kept on her desk for years. The garden in Evanston came back in spring. It always does.